Oh, it's you again. I'm glad you find peace at my fire. If you're listening to this very moment, then that means you truly are one of the faithful, a true guardian of the light, and I deeply appreciate your company. With that being said, let us begin tonight's story. Tonight we speak of a hunter whose grin outlasted his grief, an exo who wore humor like armor over a wound that never healed. He gambled everything and lost more than most could bear, yet the city loved him for it. This is the story of the Ace of Spades, the man behind the mask of jokes. This is the story of Cayde-6. To understand Cayde-6, we must first travel back to a time long before the tower, long before the walls of the last city, and long before the world we know now was reduced to ruin. This was the golden age of humanity, an era stretched across centuries when the traveler drifted above the worlds of the solar system and gave its gifts freely to the people below. Under that great pale sphere, humanity spread outward from Earth and settled the planets and the moons. Cities rose on Mars beneath domes of glass. Colonies took root on Venus and among the icy reaches of the outer system. The human lifespan stretched longer than it had ever been, and sickness and hunger faded as distant memories. Machines carried thought, and the wonders of that age filled every corner of the sky. Within all of this prosperity, there lived a man. His name has been lost to the resets and the long fog of the centuries, and history remembers him only by the name he would one day carry into the light. Yet before he was Cayde-6, before he was an exo of shining metal and glowing optics, he was flesh and blood. He was a soldier, a man who served and fought, and returned home when his duty was done. This man had a family, and this is the tender heart of everything that follows. He had a wife whom he loved, and he had a son. The boy was young, and the father called him by a nickname, a small and affectionate word passed between father and child. He called him Ace. That single name would echo across the centuries, carried forward through machine bodies and memory wipes and countless deaths, surviving even when the man who first spoke it could no longer remember why it mattered. The soldier's home was quiet, in the way that ordinary homes are quiet. There was a wife who waited for him, a son who looked up at him, and the simple rhythm of a life shared between the three of them. The father held his boy, spoke his name, and looked toward the years ahead with the ease of a man who believed those years were his to keep. He had served his time in war, and now the road before him seemed to lead toward peace, toward a family growing older together beneath the light of the traveler. Yet even in that golden age, even beneath that watchful sphere that healed so many wounds, there were troubles that no machine could mend and no wonder could cure. The soldier carried a weakness within him, a quiet flaw that would slowly unravel the very peace he cherished. It lived in the way his pulse quickened at a wager, in the pull he felt toward the roll of the dice and the turn of the card. It was a hunger that no discipline of the battlefield had ever taught him to master, and it waited patiently within him, growing stronger with every stake he laid down. That weakness would soon test everything he held dear, and it would set into motion the long chain of events that carried him away from his family and into a fate he never chose for himself. The soldier sat at a scratched metal table in the lower levels of a sprawling transit hub. Neon lights buzzed overhead and cast long, sharp shadows across piles of polymer chips and scattered playing cards. Smoke drifted from the cigars of the men seated around him, smelling of burning tar and cheap synthetic tobacco. The soldier pushed a tall stack of chips into the center of the table, and he watched the dealer reveal the final card. The dealer possessed a higher hand, so he swept the chips away into a metal lockbox. The soldier placed his hands flat against the cool surface of the table and stood up. He walked out into the narrow alleyway and pulled his coat tight against the biting wind. The ledger on his personal datapad displayed a massive balance owed to the brokers, showing a string of red digits extending further with each passing week. He returned to his small home and sat in the dark kitchen. He poured a glass of tap water and stared at the worn floorboards. He spoke aloud to the empty room, detailing the damage his wages caused to his life. He gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He looked at his trembling hands, and yet he returned to the transit hub the very next night. He carried the belief that the next hand would clear the ledger completely. He wagered his standard-issue military sidearm, and he watched the dealer take it. He wagered a portion of his upcoming military pension, and he handed over the authorization forms for that as well. He sat across from men with deep, jagged scars across their faces and heavy pistols resting on their laps. These men lent him physical currency with exorbitant interest rates, and they documented every transaction on encrypted drives. The soldier signed his name over and over, signing away his future wages for another chance at the card table. The red numbers on his pad grew larger with every signature. The men holding his markers demanded payment. The scarred men visited the soldier's street and stood directly beneath the glow of the street lamps, watching his front door. The soldier took jobs from them to reduce the balance. He carried heavy, sealed crates through the loading docks at midnight, and he loaded them onto ships painted in flat grey. He stood watch in warehouses with shattered windows and collapsed roofs, while illicit goods changed hands between smugglers. He drove transport skiffs across desolate stretches of wasteland, delivering cargo with welded steel seals. He took currency from criminals and handed it directly back to the gambling brokers. He handed them more currency each week, and the brokers demanded more jobs and more of his time in return. Inside the quiet house, his wife slept while he paced the hallway. He stopped in front of the bedroom door and watched the steady rise and fall of her chest. He walked into his son's room and stood over the small bed. Ace clutched a stuffed fabric toy, his face smooth against the cotton pillow. The soldier reached out and adjusted the thick woolen blanket over the boy's shoulders. He held a physical photograph of his wife and son in his pocket, running his thumb over the glossy paper. He wanted to stay in this house, sit at the dinner table with them, and watch his boy grow tall. He looked out the window and saw the men under the street lamps, holding heavy rifles. He saw the glint of the streetlights reflecting off their drawn blades. He packed a canvas duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes and a spare rationing kit. He wrote a physical letter on a piece of paper, detailing his love for his family, and he left it resting on the kitchen counter. He stepped out the back door and slipped through the narrow gaps between the residential blocks. He walked for hours until the quiet residential neighborhoods gave way to the towering metal structures of the industrial sectors. He planned to secure a massive payout, hand the required currency to the brokers, and walk back through his front door holding the cleared ledger. He found a seat in a bustling spaceport terminal, resting his elbows on his knees. He watched ships launch into the atmosphere and leave trails of white exhaust against the blue sky. He counted the few physical coins remaining in his pocket. The sum provided exactly enough for a single meal. He sat in the hard plastic terminal chair, watching the crowds pass by the transit gates. A man in a pristine white suit walked across the terminal floor. He carried a datapad bearing the sharp, geometric emblem of the Clovis Bray Corporation, and he stopped his stride directly in front of the soldier. The man in the pristine white suit stood perfectly still, his polished black shoes resting on the scuffed tiles of the spaceport terminal. He possessed broad shoulders and a sharp jawline, and he looked down at the soldier, seated in the molded plastic chair. Two armored guards stood behind him, their hands resting on the grips of heavy pulse rifles. Their helmets obscured their faces behind opaque black visors, and their tactical vests bore a sharp, geometric emblem stitched into the fabric. The man introduced himself as Clovis Bray, the founder and chief director of the Braytech Corporation. Braytech manufactured the sleek robotic units patrolling the terminal, and their logo sat stamped on the military transport vessels outside. Clovis Bray reached into his tailored jacket and withdrew a thin glass datapad. He held it out, and the soldier took it into his calloused hands. The screen displayed a highly detailed ledger. The soldier recognized the long string of red digits immediately, identifying the exact numerical value of the currency he owed to the brokers in the lower levels of the city. Bray tapped the glass surface with a silver stylus. The red numbers dissolved, and a row of green zeros replaced them. Bray spoke with slow, measured enunciation. He offered to completely erase the soldier's accumulated gambling debts, and he offered to deposit a massive sum of physical currency into an encrypted trust account. This trust account required the biometric signatures of the soldier's wife and his son, Ace, for access. In exchange, Bray required the soldier to accept a permanent security contract with the Braytech Corporation. The soldier scrolled through the glowing text of the contract. Thick, solid black rectangles covered entire paragraphs of the document. The text contained heavy redactions regarding the physical location of the assignment, the duration of the deployment, and the specific duties required of the contractor. The datapad listed requirements for extensive medical examinations, followed by dozens of blacked-out lines. The soldier asked aloud about the redacted information. Clovis Bray kept his hands folded behind his back, and he instructed the soldier to focus strictly on the bottom line. He pointed his gloved finger to the green zeros on the screen and the clause guaranteeing the safety and financial security of the soldier's family. The soldier looked past Clovis Bray and stared at the terminal entrance doors. He pictured the scarred men standing under the flickering street lamps in his neighborhood, holding their heavy rifles and running sharpening stones along the edges of their blades. The brokers demanded currency by the end of the week, and the soldier held only a handful of loose coins in his pocket. The men in the alleys possessed the physical means to break down his front door, and they possessed the cruelty to harm his sleeping wife and his young boy. The soldier rubbed the frayed edge of the photograph, hidden deep in his coat pocket. He placed the datapad flat on his knees and took the silver stylus from Clovis Bray's extended hand. He pressed the metal tip of the stylus against the glass screen. He traced the letters of his full, given name on the digital signature line. The tablet emitted a short chime, and the screen flashed a solid green color. Clovis Bray took the datapad, slid it back into the inner pocket of his white jacket, and nodded to the armored guards standing behind him. One of the guards stepped forward and handed the soldier a thick, metallic boarding pass. The metal plate displayed a single barcode and a set of flight coordinates. Bray instructed the soldier to board the deep space transport vessel waiting at Gate 7. He explained that the coordinates led to a Bray exoscience facility located on the surface of Europa, the frozen moon orbiting Jupiter. Bray turned on his polished heels and walked away across the terminal floor. The soldier stood up from the hard plastic chair. He hoisted the canvas duffel bag over his shoulder and walked down the long, brightly lit corridor toward Gate 7. He handed the metallic pass to the flight attendant at the desk, and he walked down the pressurized boarding tunnel. The air inside the tunnel smelled strongly of aviation fuel and synthetic rubber sealants. He stepped inside the passenger cabin of the transport vessel and found his assigned seat near a thick window. He secured the heavy harness over his chest. The ship's thrusters ignited, sending a deep vibration through the metal floorboards. He looked out the window as the vessel lifted off the concrete launch pad, watching the sprawling cityscape shrink into a patchwork of grey squares. The navigation computers locked their trajectory onto the distant, icy sphere of Europa, carrying the soldier steadily toward the sterile medical bays of the Bray Exoscience facility. The transport vessel touched down on a landing pad carved directly into a thick glacier. The heavy metal ramp lowered, grinding against the ice. The soldier walked out into a storm of thick white snow and driving wind. He pulled the thick collar of his thermal jacket up over his chin and marched toward the towering steel doors of the Bray Exoscience facility. The doors slid apart, revealing long corridors constructed of bright white polymers, polished steel plating, and glaring fluorescent lights. The soldier began his assignment as a security officer inside the facility. He stood beside reinforced glass doors in the lower levels. He checked the biometric identification badges of researchers walking past him, watching them carry transparent data pads and sealed sample containers filled with glowing fluids. A constant, low hum echoed through the facility from large atmospheric processors spinning inside the ventilation shafts. During a scheduled patrol in the subterranean containment sector, a high-pitched alarm sounded through the corridor. Red emergency lights rotated along the ceiling tiles. The soldier ran down the hall toward a heavy laboratory door. A pressurized pipe running parallel to the ceiling ruptured with a deafening crack. A concentrated blast of supercooled atmospheric gas and caustic pale blue coolant sprayed directly into the hallway. The expanding wave of gas threw the soldier backward into the opposite bulkhead. The chemical mixture soaked through his thermal layers, blistering his skin and freezing the muscle tissue underneath. Emergency medical drones flew into the corridor, extended metallic clamps, and loaded him onto a hovering stretcher. They transported him up an elevator shaft to a sterile trauma ward. He lay on a firm medical bed under the heat of bright surgical lamps. Chemical burns covered his arms, chest, and neck. A medical monitor displayed his pulse with sharp, erratic tones. Clovis Bray walked into the trauma ward and stood beside the metal frame of the bed. Bray held out a transparent data pad, displaying a final consent form. The soldier breathed in shallow, ragged gasps. Bray tapped the data pad, projecting a holographic schematic of a robotic chassis. He offered the soldier an upload into an exo frame to preserve his consciousness, presenting the medical scans that showed systemic biological failure across the soldier's remaining organs. The soldier looked up at the perforated ceiling tiles. He pictured the photograph of his wife and his son Ace sitting in the pocket of his ruined coat. He reached out with a heavily bandaged hand, took the stylus from Bray, and pressed his signature onto the glass screen. Automated surgical arms descended from a hidden compartment in the ceiling. The machines secured a heavy metal halo around the soldier's skull. Hundreds of microscopic steel needles extended from the halo and pierced his scalp, sinking deep into his brain tissue. The medical bay filled with the sound of whirring hard drives and clicking electrical relays. The sensors scanned the electrical impulses firing across his synapses, mapping the neural pathways and writing them into a digital matrix. Automated pumps injected a heavy, dark preservation fluid through tubes inserted into his veins. The monitor tracking his pulse emitted a single, continuous tone. The soldier's biological body ceased to function on the surgical table. In a separate observation room down the hall, a mechanical chassis rested on an inclined diagnostic bed. The frame consisted of titanium plating, reinforced carbon joints, and thick bundles of synthetic muscle cables. Two optical sensors set inside a smooth grey metal faceplate ignited, glowing with a bright blue light. The machine sat up. The servos in its neck whined as it turned its head from side to side. The exo looked down at its lap. It flexed its articulated metal fingers and tapped its steel fingertips against its metallic thighs. The machine accessed its internal memory drives. The data files holding the human soldier's past contained corrupted segments. The digital transfer recorded large gaps in the neural maps, leaving wide blocks of empty code. The exo processed visual files of a house, a woman, and a young boy, with the edges of the images blurring into digital static. Its audio processors played the name ACE alongside a loop of background interference. The machine retained the visual memory of a massive debt, a signed contract, and the freezing impact of the chemical spill. The exo pushed itself off the diagnostic bed, and its heavy metal feet clanked against the polished floor tiles. The machine walked to a nearby supply terminal, picked up a blank paper journal and a graphite pen with its metal hands, and carried them to a small metal desk in the corner of the room. The exo sat at the small metal desk and pressed the tip of the graphite pen against the lined paper of the journal. The mechanical servos in his wrist whined as he guided the pen across the page, forming sharp, precise letters. He wrote the name ACE at the very top of the first white sheet. He stared at the word, processing the shapes of the characters through his optical sensors. He pressed the pen down again and documented the exact sequence of events leading to his current physical state. He wrote about the transit hub, the polymer chips, and the red digits on his datapad. He recorded the details of the contract he signed with the Clovis Bray Corporation, detailing the transaction that cleared his financial debt in exchange for his biological body. He described the chemical spill in the subterranean corridor, the blistering cold of the coolant on his skin, and the surgical needles piercing his scalp during the upload process. The graphite smeared against the edge of his metal hand as he filled the page from top to bottom. He stood up from the metal desk and walked directly to the communications terminal, mounted on the wall of his quarters. He typed his previous civilian identification number into the keypad, attempting to route a message to the residential sector on Earth. The terminal screen flashed a solid crimson color and displayed a locked padlock icon. He pressed his metallic fingertips against the glass, and the system registered a complete biometric mismatch. Armed guards equipped with kinetic rifles stood outside his door, patrolling the white corridors of the Bray Exoscience facility. The heavy steel blast doors separating the medical wings from the exterior landing pads remained locked behind complex encrypted keypads. The communications terminal restricted signal transmissions strictly to authorized personnel, and the docking manifests required specific biometric flight codes to board departing transport vessels. He returned to the small metal desk and opened the journal to the next blank paper page. He wrote specific, direct sentences addressed to the boy. He detailed the reasons for his absence, explaining the transaction allowing his family to keep their house and provisions. He wrote the words down, telling Ace he executed the only available option to ensure their survival. He recorded his intent to return to them, pushing the pen firmly into the paper. He wrote that his actions served as the required payment to see Ace and his mother again. He described his new physical form to the boy, detailing the titanium plating, the carbon joints, and the glowing blue optical sensors. He instructed Ace to look for the man inside the metal shell, writing a strict promise to locate their house and walk through the front door as soon as his contract concluded. He turned the page and drew the shape of a playing card. He sketched the outline of the ace of spades, filling the large black symbol in the center of the paper. He assigned this symbol directly to his son, designating it as a physical marker to remember him by. Beside it, he drew the Queen of Hearts, shading the symbol with a red ink stylus found inside the desk drawer. He wrote the word Queen beneath the drawing, assigning this specific title to his wife. He filled the subsequent pages with repeating sketches of these two playing cards, pressing the tools into the paper until the symbols darkened and indented the sheets. These two symbols served as his anchors to the biological life he left behind, and he committed their shapes to his digital memory drives. He carried the physical journal with him during his assigned security patrols. He walked through the subterranean levels, his metal boots echoing against the grated floors. He stood watch outside the pressurized containment cells, holding a standard-issue kinetic rifle across his chest. During his scheduled rest cycles, he sat in the corners of the employee barracks and retrieved the book. He read the entries over and over, scanning the graphite letters to reinforce the data files inside his memory drives. He traced his metal index finger over the drawn shapes of the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts. He unbolted a section of the titanium plating on his chest and slid the journal inside the cavity, resting it directly next to his internal power source. The compartment sealed shut with an airtight hiss, hiding the book from the optical sensors of the facility overseers. The journal remained secure against his synthetic core, adding a small amount of physical weight to his frame. The Braytech Corporation scheduled regular maintenance cycles for all active EXO units, requiring the technicians to prepare the medical bays and connect the synthetic frames to the diagnostic beds for mandatory neural adjustments. Technicians in sterile white suits strapped the EXO to the inclined diagnostic bed. They attached thick bundles of fiber optic cables to the ports at the base of his metallic skull. The monitors beside the bed displayed cascading columns of code, tracking the neural activity within his synthetic brain. The human consciousness mapped within the digital matrix actively rejected the mechanical host, generating massive electrical feedback loops inside the central processor core. The synthetic limbs jerked uncontrollably, striking the metal sides of the diagnostic bed, and the optical sensors flickered rapidly between bright blue and a dull, faded gray. The technicians typed specific command sequences into the terminal to stabilize the neural pathways. The process scrubbed the memory drives, overwriting massive blocks of stored visual and audio files with blank, functional code. The technicians took a heated laser tool and burned a physical number into the metal plating of his chassis, marking the exact sequence of his system reboots. They etched the number 6 into his frame, indicating the completion of 5 total memory wipes since his initial upload. The EXO powered back on and unlatched the heavy restraints. He walked to the corner of the room, opened his chest compartment, and pulled out the paper journal. The graphite letters and the red ink shapes of the playing cards remained intact on the physical pages. He stared at the word Ace and the word Queen, running his metallic fingers over the indentations in the paper. He read the entries repeatedly, forcing the phonetic sounds through his vocal processors to rebuild the neural connections broken by the reset. He gripped the edge of the metal desk until the carbon joints in his knuckles groaned under the pressure. He stood in the shadows of the maintenance corridors, pressing his back against the cold steel bulkheads and monitoring the heavy footsteps of the passing technicians. He actively avoided the medical wards, hiding behind massive ventilation units to ensure the technicians could not attach the cables to his skull again. He secured the journal tightly inside his chest plate, relying exclusively on the physical paper to retain the shapes of the people he documented. The multiple memory wipes left jagged fragments of code scattered across his internal drives. Sudden visual files flashed across his optical sensors during his standard operations. He viewed a distinct recording of a sprawling jungle featuring thick, green vines and pools of bubbling, yellow sulfuric liquid. In this recording, he stood inside a reinforced concrete bunker bearing the emblem of the Ishtar Collective on the planet Venus. He held a heavy kinetic rifle, standing shoulder to shoulder with a human researcher named Dr. Maya Sundaresh. She wore a white laboratory coat and utilized high-heat laser scalpels to cut through bronze plating on unmoving machine parts. Small, glowing red sensors sat dead inside the bronze frames, and the air in the bunker smelled heavily of ozone and scorched metal. The visual file cut to static and immediately replaced itself with another fragmented recording. He saw a ruined world composed of shattered stone columns and a sky filled with dark, churning clouds. A massive, amorphous black shape moved through the rubble, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked ground and pulling the stone pillars down into the dirt with sprawling, jagged appendages. He documented these fragmented images in the blank pages of his journal, sketching the thick vines, the bronze machine parts, and the dark shapes with his graphite pen. He carried the rifle and guarded the concrete research facilities on the Venusian surface. The atmospheric processes above the facility hummed continuously, pulling the heavy sulfuric air through thick industrial filters. He walked the perimeter of the outpost, checking the heavy magnetic locks on the exterior doors and watching the yellow rain stream down the reinforced glass windows. Sirens suddenly blared through the Ishtar Collective bunkers, echoing off the concrete walls with deafening, repetitive, metallic shrieks. The sky outside the reinforced windows shifted rapidly from a hazy yellow to a deep, impenetrable black. Massive geometric shapes descended through the thick atmosphere, blocking out the light of the sun and casting total darkness over the facility. The temperature inside the bunker plummeted instantly, freezing the condensation on the glass. The tectonic plates beneath the facility shifted violently, cracking the concrete floor and tearing the steel support beams directly out of the ceiling. The massive white sphere floating above the planet Earth cracked along its lower hemisphere. Black, geometric vessels in the shape of tetrahedrons pierced the atmospheres of the surrounding planets. These angular ships cast sharp, triangular shadows across the cities, blocking the light of the sun. The air temperature across the solar system plummeted, freezing the water in the aqueducts and turning the rain into heavy hail. The glass domes protecting the settlements on Mars shattered under immense atmospheric pressure, exposing the habitats to the harsh red sand. The automated robotic frames guarding the outposts sparked and fell to the ground as their internal power cells ruptured. Gravity shifted violently along the coastlines. The oceans swelled and slammed into the land, dragging steel structures, concrete roads, and thousands of vehicles underwater. Tectonic plates ground together beneath the surface, splitting the continents and sending plumes of superheated magma spraying into the sky. Cayde stood inside a crumbling transit corridor on a distant colony, holding his kinetic rifle tightly against his chest plate. Technicians had etched the number 6 into his titanium frame during his final memory wipe. He tracked the movement of tall, shifting dark shapes with his blue optical sensors. The concrete walls of the corridor buckled inward, groaning under the weight of the collapsing structure above. Dust and pulverized rock rained down from the ceiling tiles, coating his metal shoulders in a thick layer of gray powder. He raised his rifle and squeezed the trigger. The heavy recoil pushed against his synthetic joints, and empty brass casings clattered against the metal floor grates. The air in the corridor smelled heavily of burning ozone and scorched carbon. A violent tremor shook the floor grates. The steel support beams lining the corridor snapped. A massive slab of reinforced concrete fell directly from the ceiling and struck Cayde-6. The impact crushed his titanium chest plating and pinned him flat against the floor. His carbon joints bent and cracked under the immense weight. The internal power source housed deep inside his chassis sparked, leaking a slow stream of viscous synthetic fluid onto the ground. The physical journal, containing the sketches of the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts, remained pressed flat inside his ruptured chest compartment. His optical sensors flickered rapidly. The blue light dimmed to a pale white, and the glass lenses cracked down the center. His audio processors recorded the sound of tearing metal and rushing wind. The synthetic fluid drained completely from his lines. His internal temperature dropped to match the freezing air filling the corridor. Total system failure shut down his primary drives, leaving his mechanical body motionless under the rubble. High above the earth, the massive white sphere emitted a blinding pulse of pure, concentrated white light. The wave of energy expanded outward, traveling rapidly across the vacuum of space. The light struck the angular black ships, halting their descent and pushing their massive hulls back toward the outer edges of the solar system. The white sphere remained suspended over the planet, silent and unmoving. Large, jagged fragments of its white outer shell broke away and drifted into low orbit. The blinding flash faded, leaving the ruined cities and shattered colonies in deep twilight. Thick layers of dirt and ash settled over the cracked asphalt of the roadways. The rubber tires on the abandoned vehicles rotted away, leaving rusted steel rims resting on the dirt. Thick green vines grew up the sides of the broken skyscrapers, wrapping tightly around the shattered glass windows and pulling the frames from the masonry. Wind blew across the frozen surfaces of the outer moons, burying the collapsed research facilities under heavy drifts of white snow. The crushed frame of Cayde-6 rested undisturbed in the dark, buried under tons of concrete and accumulated ice. Rain washed over the exposed bones of the human populations, turning the soil into thick, brown mud. Decades turned into centuries. The metal structures oxidized, turning a bright, flaky orange. Tall grass pushed through the floorboards of the abandoned residential homes. The wind howled through the empty transit hubs, carrying the smell of damp earth, stagnant water, and decaying rust. In the sky above the overgrown ruins, hundreds of small, metallic machines descended through the clouds. These floating devices featured a central mechanical eye surrounded by a shifting geometric shell. They hovered silently over the rusted vehicles and the collapsed concrete buildings. They projected wide cones of blue light from their central lenses, scanning the dirt, the rusted metal, and the buried bones scattered across the solar system. The small, floating machines emerged directly from the shattered outer shell of the massive white sphere suspended over the Earth. They drifted down through the atmosphere and spread across the ruined continents and the frozen outer colonies. These machines featured a central mechanical eye encased in shifting, geometric shells of polished metal. They hovered over the decaying cities and the blasted wastelands, projecting wide cones of blue light across the soil. The light penetrated the dirt, the rusted steel beams, and the thick layers of ice. The machines scanned the physical remains of the fallen populations, emitting a low, continuous electronic hum as they worked. One specific machine drifted into the collapsed transit corridor on the frozen Jovian colony. This unit possessed a jagged, star-shaped exterior shell, painted with faded orange accents. It navigated through the hanging wires and the mounds of pulverized concrete. It stopped directly over the pile of rubble, burying the crushed titanium frame of the Exo. The machine directed its blue scanning beam through the cracks in the stones, illuminating the broken metal plating and the dark, offline optical sensors. The geometric shell of the floating machine expanded outward, separating into distinct metallic fragments. A blinding sphere of white light erupted from its central eye, washing over the collapsed rubble. The white light enveloped the broken Exo chassis. The heavy concrete slabs lifted off the metal frame and rolled away into the dirt. The crushed titanium chest plates bent outward, reforming into smooth, seamless armor. The snapped carbon joints fused together, and the synthetic fluid refilled the empty internal lines. The cracked glass lenses covering his optical sensors repaired themselves instantly, and a bright blue light ignited inside his mechanical eyes. The machine introduced herself as a ghost named Sundance. She floated at his eye level and spoke through a small internal speaker, assigning him the title of Light Bearer. The Exo sat up from the frozen dirt. He pulled a sharp draft of cold air through his intake valves. He looked down at his metal hands, flexing the articulated fingers. He accessed his internal memory drives to retrieve his identification data. The system returned blank files and corrupted code blocks. The drives contained zero records of his name, his location, or the events leading to his physical destruction. He looked around the ruined corridor. Snow blew through the gaping holes in the ceiling, piling into thick white drifts against the rusted bulkheads. He lowered his head and dropped his chin against his chest plate. He wrapped his metal arms tightly around his knees. His audio processors recorded only the sound of the wind and the mechanical hum of the ghost hovering beside him. Water droplets formed on his metal faceplate from the melting snow. He felt a physical weight resting inside the cavity of his chest plate. He reached up and unlatched the titanium panel. He reached inside and pulled out the small rectangular paper journal. The edges of the paper were frayed, and dark stains of dried synthetic fluid covered the binding. He opened the cover and turned the pages with his metal thumb. He looked at the graphite letters spelling the name Ace. He looked at the red ink drawings of the Queen of Hearts and the Ace of Spades. He ran his optical sensors over the paragraphs detailing a house, a wife, and a young boy. He submitted the names and the drawings to his internal search protocols. The system responded with zero matching data. He placed the open journal on his lap. He reached into the dirt beside his feet and retrieved the graphite pen. He pressed the tip of the pen against the next blank page. He wrote a new sequence of letters documenting the frozen corridor, the floating machine named Sundance, and the low temperatures registering across his synthetic core. He addressed the entry directly to Ace. He copied the exact shape of the letters from the previous pages. He filled the sheet of paper with his handwriting, tracing the physical lines of the ink over and over again to anchor his newly repaired mind to the book. He closed the journal and placed it back inside his chest cavity. The titanium plate sealed shut with a metallic click. He pushed himself off the frozen ground and stood up to his full height. He reached into the snow and grabbed the handle of the rusted kinetic rifle. He pulled the weapon free and brushed the ice from the barrel. He stepped over the fallen concrete blocks and walked out of the dark transit corridor. He followed the floating shell of the ghost into the blinding white storm, marching away from the ruins and setting his boots on the long trail leading across the untamed planetary frontier. Cayde-6 traveled across the cracked asphalt of the old highways. He scavenged thick fabric cloaks from abandoned supply depots and draped them over his titanium shoulders. He carried a heavy revolver, holstered low on his right thigh, and he climbed up the rusted iron ladders of tall communication towers. He looked through the glass lenses of optical scopes, charting the movements of hostile alien scavengers below. He fired high-caliber rounds from his hand cannon, striking targets across long distances and collecting salvage technology from the wreckage. He brought physical maps and encrypted data drives back to the last city, placing them on the metal tables inside the tower hangars. Other light-bearers wearing cloaks gathered around his ship, examining the heavy crates of recovered Golden Age machinery and exchanging stacks of physical glimmer coins for his coordinates. He walked the frontier alongside a specific group of cloaked light-bearers. He traveled with an exo named Shiro 4. Shiro wore a cloak patterned with yellow geometric shapes and carried a long sniper rifle strapped securely across his back. Shiro possessed a yellow optical sensor and wore armor woven with thick synthetic fibers. Beside them walked an awoken man named Andal Brusk. Andal featured pale blue skin, glowing eyes, and dark hair pulled back tightly from his face. Andal wore a leather jacket with heavy stitching under a thick brown cloak. The three of them rode sleek hoverbikes called Sparrows across the vast red sand dunes of Mars and through the thick, overgrown vegetation of Venusian jungles. Their Sparrows left long trails of dust and kicked up clumps of wet earth behind them as they navigated the ruined terrain. They built fires from splintered wood and broken crates inside the ruins of collapsed concrete buildings. Cayde sat on an overturned bucket next to the flames, pulling a physical deck of playing cards from his utility pouch. He shuffled the cards rapidly between his articulated metal fingers, bridging the halves perfectly together. He snapped the cards onto a flat stone, revealing the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts to Andal and Shiro. He manipulated his vocal processors to emit sharp, loud bursts of synthesized laughter. He spun the heavy hand cannon around his index finger and slid it effortlessly into the leather holster. He leaned his metal head back against the concrete wall and watched the sparks from the fire rise into the dark sky. Andal sat directly across the fire from Cayde, tossing spare ammunition cartridges and metallic weapon parts over the flames to the exo. They disassembled their rifles side by side, wiping carbon scoring from the firing pins with oily rags. They stood back to back during firefights inside the buried transit tunnels, firing kinetic rounds into groups of hostile scavengers. Andal pulled Cayde onto the back of his Sparrow when the exo's vehicle took heavy plasma fire and exploded into pieces. Cayde repaired Andal's cracked armor plating with a high-heat welding torch, fusing the torn metal together. They shared a specific physical proximity at all times, standing shoulder to shoulder in the hangars and riding in tight formation across the planetary surfaces. Cayde operated his Sparrow with the throttle fully engaged. He launched the vehicle off the edges of jagged cliffs and landed heavily on the dirt roads below, compressing the suspension shocks. He navigated through the narrow, twisting stone canyons of the scattered asteroid colonies, leaning his titanium frame close to the handlebars to reduce drag. He collected bounties printed on physical paper sheets, tracking specific targets across the solar system and securing them with heavy steel cuffs. He fired his weapon while jumping through the air, striking hostile targets before his metal boots touched the ground. He maintained a constant forward momentum, walking out of the massive steel gates of the last city mere hours after returning from his previous long deployments. He pulled the hood of his cloak over his optical sensors and pointed his ship toward the uncharted coordinates on his navigation terminal. The three light-bearers tracked a high-value bounty across the gray craters of the lunar surface. They parked their Sparrows behind a ridge of jagged moon rock and climbed to the peak on foot. They looked down into a wide, circular crater holding a massive crashed transport ship. The ship bore the dark red and dull gold colors of the alien scavengers. Heavy metal ramps lowered from the sides of the ship, crushing the gray lunar dust underneath. A towering alien figure stepped out onto the ramp. The figure possessed 4 thick arms and wore a heavy, fur-lined cape over thick mechanical augmentations. Thick metal tubes ran from his back directly into the ports on his neck and along his jawline. He held a massive, glowing scorch cannon in his lower right hand, and the weapon emitted a bright, pulsing orange light across the crater. The towering alien figure on the ramp breathed a mixture of synthetic ether and oxygen through the heavy metal tubes connected to his mask. The bounty boards across the last city displayed his face alongside massive sums of physical glimmer, identifying him as Cayde-6, the Scarred. He operated strictly as an independent mercenary, taking contracts for physical payment and raw ether from the highest bidders across the system. He wore a heavy cloak woven from thick, dark fur, and he covered his chest with overlapping plates of scavenged steel. He replaced massive portions of his biological body with heavy mechanical prosthetics, bolting hydraulic pistons and titanium joints directly into his remaining organic tissue. These mechanical augmentations allowed him to survive extensive physical trauma, returning from catastrophic injuries with completely new robotic limbs. He collected physical armor pieces from his eliminated targets, integrating their gear into his own mechanical frame. Cayde-6 raised the glowing scorch cannon and fired a highly pressurized sphere of superheated solar energy directly at the ridge of moon rock. The projectile impacted the gray stone and detonated with a deafening blast. The explosion shattered the rock and sent a shockwave of thermal energy across the crater. Cayde, Andal, and Shiro dove away from the impact zone, sliding across the loose lunar dust. The thermal wave melted the surface of the rocks, leaving pools of glowing liquid slag cooling rapidly in the vacuum of space. Shiro planted his boots into the dust and mounted his long sniper rifle on a flat stone. He looked through the optical scope and fired a high-velocity, armor-piercing round at the mercenary. The heavy bullet struck the thick metal plating on Cayde-6's shoulder, denting the steel and sending a shower of bright sparks into the air. Cayde-6 barely registered the physical impact. He rotated his heavy mechanical torso and fired a secondary weapon from his upper left arm, unleashing a volley of rapid arc energy blasts. The blue plasma projectiles scorched the ground around Shiro, forcing the cloaked light-bearer to abandon his position and roll behind a large boulder. Andal sprinted along the edge of the crater ridge, using the jagged rocks for physical cover. He unholstered his weapon and fired a continuous stream of kinetic rounds at the mercenary. The bullets ricocheted off the heavy hydraulic pistons in Cayde-6's robotic legs, leaving bright silver scratches across the dark metal. Cayde-6 adjusted his stance, planting his mechanical boots firmly into the metal ramp of his ship. He tracked Andal's movement and fired the scorch cannon again. The solar projectile struck the ground mere meters behind Andal, throwing him forward into the dust and tearing a long gash into his heavy brown cloak. Cayde activated the thrusters built into his boots, launching his titanium frame high into the air above the crater. He drew his heavy hand cannon and fanned the hammer, firing large-caliber rounds in rapid succession. The heavy slugs struck Cayde-6 directly in the chest plate, cracking the scavenged steel and rupturing a pressurized ether tube. Thick white gas sprayed into the atmosphere from the broken line. Cayde-6 let out a deep, guttural roar through his vocal processors. He aimed the scorch cannon upward, tracking the Exo through the sky with a sweep of the burning weapon. Cayde twisted his body in mid-air, avoiding the incoming solar blast. He landed heavily on a nearby rock outcropping, compressing the internal shocks in his synthetic knees. The three light-bearers maintained a continuous crossfire, boxing the mercenary in with kinetic bullets and precision sniper fire. The heavy metal ramp of the transport ship began to retract, grinding loudly against the internal gears. Cayde-6 stepped backward into the cargo bay, absorbing multiple impacts into his mechanical chassis. The heavy bay doors slid shut with a loud metallic crash, sealing the mercenary inside. The ship's main thrusters ignited, burning the lunar soil and launching the massive vessel upward into the dark sky. Cayde, Andal, and Shiro regrouped at the edge of the crater. They looked at the melted stone and the deep impact craters left by the scorch cannon. They wiped the grey dust from their weapons and evaluated the physical capabilities of the mercenary. The three of them walked back to their sparrows and navigated across the lunar surface toward their own jump ships. They returned to the last city and parked their vessels inside the main hangar. They walked into a dimly lit supply room and sat around a circular metal table. A specific administrative position within the last city's command structure remained empty for 2 consecutive solar years. The seat of the Hunter Vanguard sat completely vacant, requiring a light-bearer to abandon the planetary frontiers and handle logistical paperwork inside the tower walls. The Hunters actively avoided this position, preferring to walk the dirt roads and map the outer colonies. Andal placed his hands flat on the metal table and looked directly at Cayde, proposing a highly specific set of rules to determine exactly who would handle the mercenary and who would take the empty seat. The command hall of the last city featured a wide circular table constructed of polished white stone and glowing holographic projectors. A massive man with pale blue skin and thick ceramic shoulder armor stood at one side of the table, constantly reviewing defensive grid schematics. A woman wearing purple woven robes stood opposite him, monitoring encrypted transmissions from the outer colonies. A third space at the table remained empty. A tall chair, upholstered in dark leather, sat behind this space, accumulating a thick layer of grey dust. Stacks of transparent datapads piled up on the stone surface in front of the chair, blinking with unread logistical reports and unapproved supply requisitions. 2 full orbital cycles of the Earth passed with this chair sitting completely vacant. The light-bearers wearing cloaks actively avoided the command hall, altering their flight paths to land in secondary hangars and remaining strictly on the planetary frontiers. They dreaded the administrative datapads and craved the physical action of the uncharted wilderness. Cayde and Andal Brask sat around the metal table inside the dimly lit supply room. Andal unrolled a physical paper bounty poster and pressed it flat against the metal surface. The paper displayed the ink-drawn face of the alien mercenary, Cayde-6, alongside his specific mechanical augmentations. Andal drew his hunting knife and drove the steel blade through the center of the poster, pinning it to the table. He outlined the terms of a physical wager, designating the bet as the Vanguard Dare. He specified the conditions of the agreement using clear, precise language. The light-bearer, who delivered the terminating kinetic round into the mercenary's central chassis, retained his clearance to fly jump ships across the solar system. The light-bearer, who failed to secure the bounty, agreed to walk into the command hall, sit in the dust-covered leather chair, and process the administrative datapads for the remaining Hunter population. Cayde reached across the table and gripped Andal's hand, locking their fingers together and sealing the physical agreement. They separated their jump ships and initiated independent search patterns across the solar system. Cayde flew his vessel toward the outer asteroid belt, tracking the specific thermal exhaust signatures emitted by the mercenary's transport ship. He landed his ship on the surface of a dark, rocky asteroid and traversed the jagged terrain on foot. He located the mercenaries' encampment, situated deep inside a hollowed-out impact crater. Heavy canvas tents surrounded a central landing pad, and armed mechanical drones patrolled the perimeter. Cayde infiltrated the camp by dropping down from a high stone ridge. He drew his heavy hand cannon and fired large-caliber rounds into the mechanical guards, shattering their optical sensors and dropping them to the dirt. Cayde-6 emerged from the largest canvas tent, carrying his glowing scorch cannon. The mercenary fired a superheated solar blast. Cayde slid across the loose gravel, passing directly under the thermal wave. He raised his hand cannon, aimed at the mercenary's primary ether manifold located on his chest plate, and pulled the trigger. The heavy slug pierced the scavenged steel armor and ruptured the pressurized tank. Thick white gas sprayed into the thin atmosphere. Cayde-6 dropped onto his mechanical knees, dropping the scorch cannon to the ground. Cayde stepped forward and fired a second round directly into the alien's metal faceplate. Cayde-6 collapsed face forward into the dirt, lying completely motionless. Cayde drew his hunting knife, sliced a long strip of dark fur from the mercenary's cloak, and secured it inside his utility pouch as a physical trophy. Cayde navigated his jump ship back to the last city and walked into the dim supply room. Andal sat at the metal table, rubbing a cloth over the barrel of his kinetic rifle. Cayde pulled the strip of dark fur from his pouch and dropped it onto the metal table. Andal looked at the severed fur, and he looked up at Cayde's optical sensors. Andal placed the cleaning cloth down. He unbuckled the heavy ammunition bandolier from his chest and laid it beside his rifle. He packed his physical combat gear into a secure steel footlocker, closed the heavy lid, and locked the brass padlock. Andal walked out of the supply room and climbed the stone steps leading to the Vanguard command hall. He stepped up to the wide wooden table, pulled back the dark leather chair, and sat down. The man in the ceramic armor and the woman in the purple robes slid the massive stacks of administrative datapads across the stone surface toward him. Andal picked up a silver stylus and began signing his name on the glass screens, authorizing supply drops and reviewing boundary patrol schedules. Cayde stood outside the thick glass windows of the command hall, watching his friend process the data terminals. Cayde turned his back to the window and walked down the corridors toward the main hangar. He climbed into the cockpit of his jump ship, ignited the primary thrusters, and launched his vessel into the open sky, holding onto his unrestricted flight clearance. He charted a course for the outer planets, carrying the physical satisfaction of his victory and focusing his optical sensors exclusively on the horizon. He accelerated through the atmosphere, completely oblivious to the alien scavengers currently gathering around the cratered asteroid, and dragging the leaking mechanical frame of the mercenary back onto a transport ship for immediate repair. Deep inside the cargo bay of a scavenged transport ship, thick mechanical claws suspended the damaged frame of Cayde-6 above a grated metal floor. Repair drones hovered around the alien mercenary, welding new titanium plating over the massive hole in his central chest chassis. Sparks showered down onto the metal grates as the drones connected thick hydraulic hoses to his primary ether manifold. Cayde-6 pumped pure, raw ether into his respiratory tubes, expanding his biological lungs and powering the freshly installed servos in his legs. The physical damage sustained on the asteroid healed underneath the heavy new armor. He detached the thick suspension cables from his shoulders and dropped onto the deck. He picked up his glowing scorch cannon from a nearby workbench, tightened his grip on the firing mechanism, and loaded a new fuel canister into the receiver. He walked to the navigation terminal on the bridge of his ship. He pressed his heavy fingers against the controls, directing the navigation computer to track a specific jump ship, emitting a recognized engine signature across the outer colonies. Andelbrask walked through the dense, overgrown vegetation of the Venusian basin. He pushed thick fern leaves away from his path and scanned the ruined concrete structures of an old Ishtar collective outpost. He carried his kinetic rifle at the ready, pointing the barrel toward the dark tree line. A superheated solar blast struck the stone pillar directly beside him, shattering the rock and sending a shower of burning debris across his leather jacket. Andal rolled across the wet dirt and fired kinetic rounds toward the thick foliage. Taniks emerged from the shadows of the trees, stepping over the fallen concrete blocks. The mercenary fired the scorch cannon again. The solar projectile hit the ground beneath Andal's boots, detonating with a concussive shockwave. The blast threw the awoken hunter backward into a rusted metal bulkhead. Andal struck the steel wall, cracking his ceramic armor and dropping his rifle into the mud. Taniks advanced across the clearing, crushing the vegetation under his heavy metallic feet. The mercenary pointed the barrel of the scorch cannon directly at Andal's chest and pulled the trigger. The blast burned through the ceramic plating and the leather jacket. Andal collapsed onto the wet soil, lying perfectly still against the ground. Cayde landed his jump ship on the rusted landing pad outside the Ishtar outpost several hours later. He walked through the dense ferns, following the trail of scorched trees and melted stone. He found Andal lying in the mud, surrounded by the charred remnants of the heavy brush. Cayde dropped his hand cannon into the dirt. He fell to his mechanical knees beside the awoken man. He placed his metal hands on Andal's shoulders, registering the cold surface of the armor through his internal thermal sensors. The glowing blue light of Cayde's optical sensors locked onto the massive burn mark in the center of Andal's chest armor. Cayde rubbed his titanium thumb over the cracked ceramic plates. He gripped the edges of Andal's thick brown cloak and pulled the fabric free from the broken metal clasps. He stood up and wrapped the torn cloak around his own titanium shoulders, pulling the heavy hood over his metal head. He retrieved his hand cannon from the mud, wiped the wet dirt from the barrel, and slid the weapon back into his thigh holster. Cayde returned to the last city and walked through the metal corridors leading to the Vanguard command hall. He wore Andal's torn brown cloak over his armor, and the frayed edges dragged across the stone tiles. He approached the wide circular table. The massive man in the ceramic shoulder armor and the woman in the purple robes looked at the physical damage on the cloak and the dried mud covering Cayde's boots. Cayde walked directly to the dark leather chair previously occupied by Andelbrask. He pulled the chair back and sat down behind the towering stacks of transparent data pads. He fulfilled the physical requirements of the wager established inside the supply room. He picked up the silver stylus, placed the tip against the glass screen of the first data pad, and pressed his signature onto the administrative forms. He processed the supply requisitions and the patrol schedules, tapping the glowing green authorization icons on the glass screens. He kept his kinetic hand cannon resting flat on the white stone table, directly beside his metal hand. He utilized the command hall's central surveillance terminal, accessing the encrypted tracking feeds from the outer planetary relays. He pulled the surveillance data across the holographic projector, scanning the transit logs for the specific engine signature belonging to the alien mercenaries' transport ship. He stockpiled high-caliber ammunition cartridges inside the desk drawers beneath the stone table. He compiled a growing list of physical coordinates, loading the data into his personal datapad and preparing his mechanical frame to leave the command hall to resume his pursuit of Taniks. Cayde-6 sat at the white stone table in the Vanguard Command Hall. He stared at a towering stack of transparent datapads displaying endless rows of supply requests, patrol rosters, and ammunition inventory logs. He held a silver stylus between his articulated metal fingers and tapped the glowing green authorization boxes on the screens. He shifted his weight in the dark leather chair, stretching his titanium legs under the table. He dragged the heavy fabric of Andelbrask's torn brown cloak over his shoulder armor. He looked through the massive glass windows overlooking the last city. Jump ships ignited their thrusters and flew upward through the clouds, leaving thick trails of white exhaust in the sky. Cayde dropped the stylus onto the stone surface. He reached into his utility pouch, pulled out a handful of brass ammunition casings, and stacked them into a small pyramid on top of the completed datapads. A massive awoken man wearing thick ceramic shoulder armor walked up to the table. He possessed pale blue skin and pale glowing eyes, and he carried a large digital map under his arm. This man operated as Commander Zavala, directing the Titan Lightbearers across the defensive perimeter of the last city. A human woman wearing woven purple robes walked beside him, holding a datapad displaying encrypted surveillance feeds. She operated as Ikora Ray, instructing the Warlock Lightbearers in the extraction of alien technology and intercepted communications. Zavala unrolled the digital map across the stone table, knocking over Cayde's pyramid of brass casings. The map projected a glowing blue holographic grid of the European dead zone on Earth. Zavala pointed his thick finger at clusters of red dots, indicating hostile scavenger encampments. Zavala detailed a coordinated defensive strategy, tracing strict patrol routes along the perimeter of the alien camps. Ikora read from her datapad, listing the precise numbers of heavily armed alien units occupying the zone. Cayde drew his kinetic hand cannon from his thigh holster and spun the weapon around his index finger. He placed the heavy barrel of the revolver directly onto the center of the holographic map. He outlined a direct aerial drop into the center of the largest red cluster, proposing a concentrated barrage of high-yield explosives to scatter the hostile units. Zavala crossed his arms over his broad chest and stared directly at the exo. Ikora tapped her datapad and listed the exact casualty projections of a frontal assault. They rejected the aerial drop and locked the defensive patrol routes into the central command terminal. Cayde slid his hand cannon back into his holster, picked up his silver stylus, and resumed tapping the green authorization boxes on his logistical reports. He sat at the stone table for consecutive solar weeks, fulfilling the physical requirements of his position. He completed the required authorizations and immediately left the command hall. He walked through the narrow maintenance shafts and the dimly lit ventilation corridors to avoid the crowded public plazas. He emerged in the lower levels of the main hangar and gathered groups of cloaked hunter light-bearers around the metal shipping crates. He pulled crumpled paper maps and encrypted data drives from his pouches. He handed the coordinates to the hunters, instructing them to track specific high-value targets across the outer planets. He delegated the physical tracking of the mercenary Cayde-6 to these scouts, assigning them to locate the scavenged transport ship and report the exact flight paths back to his personal terminal. The scouts launched their jump ships from the hangar and traversed the solar system. They transmitted encrypted audio files and thermal images directly to Cayde's datapad in the command hall. Cayde compiled the intel, marking Cayde-6 movements across the lunar surface and through the asteroid belts. The mercenary moved constantly, taking contracts from various hostile factions and leaving trails of scorched earth and dismantled security frames behind him. Cayde took the excess physical currency generated by his vanguard salary and purchased heavy ordnance from the city's weapon foundries. He packed crates with high-caliber sniper rounds, explosive trip mines, and specialized kinetic rifles. He loaded these crates onto unmarked transport skiffs and buried them in shallow caves on Venus, Mars, and Earth. He established a vast network of hidden supply caches across the system, marking their exact locations with the painted symbol of a black ace of spades. The hunter scouts returned to the hangar, carrying physical evidence of the mercenaries' location. A light bearer dropped a heavy, scorched piece of titanium plating onto the hangar deck. The plating bore the specific mechanical scorch marks of Tannics' heavy cannon, and the internal tracking beacon broadcasted a weak signal originating from the deep underground tunnels of the moon. Cayde picked up the scorched metal plate and ran his thumb over the jagged edge. He walked back to the Vanguard command hall and stood before the large glass window. He loaded a fresh cylinder of kinetic rounds into his hand cannon, locking the cylinder in place with a loud click, and he keyed his jump ship's ignition sequence from his wrist terminal. Cayde-6 stood in front of the primary surveillance monitors inside the Vanguard command hall. He pressed his titanium finger against the flashing transmission button on the console. He spoke into the metallic microphone, broadcasting a set of encrypted coordinates directly to a heavily armed fire team of light bearers. The monitors displayed live video feeds transmitted from the light bearers' helmet cameras. Cayde watched the fire team ride their sparrows across the grey lunar surface and enter the deep subterranean tunnels. The light bearers located the massive gravitational lift, leading directly into the underbelly of Tannics' transport ship. They stepped into the glowing purple energy beam and ascended into the metal corridors of the alien vessel. Cayde directed their movements through the ship, tracing the layout of the corridors on his digital datapad and feeding them specific navigation vectors. The light bearers kicked open the steel doors of the bridge and confronted the towering mercenary. Tannics raised his glowing scorch cannon and fired superheated solar projectiles across the room. The light bearers dove behind the metal consoles and returned fire. They launched explosive rockets from heavy launchers, striking the thick metal plating on the mercenary's chest. The concussive blasts shattered Tannics' hydraulic pistons and severed his primary ether tubes. The mercenary collapsed onto the metal floor, grating. A final kinetic round pierced his optical sensor. The biological vital signs tracking on Cayde's monitor instantly converted into a flat, continuous green line. Cayde reached into his utility pouch and pulled out the strip of dark fur he cut from the mercenary years ago. He walked over to a high-temperature incinerator chute built into the stone wall, dropped the fur inside, and watched the flames reduce the material to white ash. He returned to the dark leather chair and pulled the stack of datapads toward his chest. The proximity klaxons mounted along the ceiling of the command hall suddenly emitted loud, oscillating metallic sirens. Commander Zavala and Ikora Ray sprinted into the room and took their positions at the circular white stone table. Ikora typed rapidly on the central console, and the holographic projector activated. The projector displayed a detailed scan of the planet Saturn and its wide rings of orbiting ice and rock. A massive, bone-white vessel, measuring thousands of kilometers in length, pushed through the rings, scattering the massive chunks of ice. Jagged, asymmetrical structures covered the hull of the ship, and a localized gravitational field warped the space directly surrounding its engines. The holographic projector updated its feed, showing a fleet of sleek, purple Awoken fighter ships intercepting the massive bone-white vessel. The Awoken ships fired volleys of blue plasma torpedoes against the hull of the giant ship. A circular weapon array opened on the side of the bone-white vessel. A blinding ring of concentrated concussive force expanded outward from the weapon. The shockwaves slammed into the awoken fleet, shattering their hulls and vaporizing the metal debris. The expanding ring of force carved a massive, empty cylinder directly through the icy rings of Saturn. Zavala placed his heavy ceramic gauntlets on the table and looked at the projection. He issued a direct verbal command to the entire Vanguard network, ordering all jump ships to establish a defensive perimeter directly above the Earth. He restricted all flight paths leading towards Saturn, enforcing a strict quarantine zone around the massive white ship. Ikora analyzed the energy readings radiating from the vessel, identifying the signature as a concentrated form of hostile alien magic utilized by a sovereign entity named Oryx. Zavala outlined a strategy focused entirely on fortifying the last city's walls and deploying heavy artillery along the outer ridges. Cayde listened to Zavala's orders and stared at the bone-white ship rotating on the projector. He pushed his chair back, stood up from the table, and walked out of the command hall. He descended the metal staircases and entered a restricted sublevel located deep beneath the primary hangars. He walked past rows of standard Vanguard interceptors and approached a specific jump ship covered in a heavy canvas tarp. He gripped the edge of the fabric and pulled it away, revealing an older spacecraft featuring angular wings and an extended engine chassis. This vessel incorporated experimental cloaking technology scavenged from crashed alien fighter ships. Cayde opened his personal toolbox and retrieved a heavy hydro spanner and a plasma welding torch. He unbolted the access panels on the side of the jump ship and exposed the hyperdrive core. He initiated a series of physical modifications to the engine block, bypassing the standard Vanguard tracking telemetry and boosting the output of the cloaking generators. He transmitted a secure physical rendezvous coordinate to the light-bearer, who eliminated Tanix. The light-bearer arrived in the sub-level carrying a heavy kinetic pulse rifle. Cayde handed over the encrypted access keys to the modified stealth ship. He pointed his titanium finger at a structural schematic of the bone-white vessel projected on a portable datapad. He traced a route showing a small hangar bay located near the primary weapon array. He instructed the light-bearer to pilot the cloaked ship past the debris field, land inside the exposed hangar bay, and physically dismantle the primary weapon generator from the inside. He connected thick copper wires between the main power cell and the cloaking array, fusing the connections together with the heated plasma torch to secure the vessel for immediate launch. The cloaked light-bearer climbed into the cockpit of the modified jump ship and ignited the hyperdrive core. The vehicle lifted off the sub-level launch pad, the exterior hull shifting through a spectrum of colors before turning completely transparent. The ship launched out of the hangars and entered low Earth orbit, charting a direct course for the rings of Saturn. The light-bearer pushed the throttle forward, burning the sublight engines. The cloaked ship approached the massive bone-white vessel, navigating carefully through the dense field of shattered ice and pulverized rock, floating around the dreadnought's hull. The ship slid smoothly into an exposed hangar bay, located near the primary weapon array. The light-bearer disembarked, leaving the vessel idling on the metal deck, and sprinted down the dark, jagged corridors of the alien ship. He located the central power relay connected to the dreadnought's main weapon and unhooked the heavy fusion core. He connected the exposed transmission wires to the terminal, overriding the firing mechanism and triggering a catastrophic overload sequence inside the array. The light-bearer sprinted back to the cloaked jump ship, boarded the cockpit, and launched the vessel back out into the debris field exactly as the main weapon array imploded, destroying the dreadnought's primary offensive capabilities. Cayde sat in the dark leather chair inside the command hall, watching the live tactical feeds broadcast on the central monitor. He observed the green authorization light flash across the screen, confirming the successful deactivation of the dreadnought's weapon. He leaned back, resting his boots on the edge of the stone table, and spun his kinetic hand cannon around his index finger. Commander Zavala walked up to the monitor, his heavy ceramic armor clanking against the floor tiles. He looked at the disabled weapon array on the screen, and he looked over at the Exo Vanguard sitting across the table. Zavala issued a direct order, commanding a massive, coordinated assault by the Titan Lightbearers. They boarded heavy Vanguard transport ships and launched towards Saturn, physically landing on the hull of the bone-white dreadnought. The Titans pushed through the jagged corridors, eliminating the hostile alien units and establishing a secure beachhead inside the massive vessel. The combined Lightbearer forces pressed deeper into the dreadnought over the following weeks. They mapped the interior layout, securing physical data drives and neutralizing the high-ranking commanders of the alien fleet. They reached the central throne room, located at the heart of the ship, confronting the sovereign entity, Oryx. The Lightbearers engaged the massive winged alien with heavy artillery and concentrated arc energy. They targeted the physical weak points in his bone armor, shattering his chest plate and dropping him onto the stone floor of the throne room. They pushed his massive physical body into the dark vacuum of space, eliminating the primary threat to the inner colonies and concluding the assault on the bone-white dreadnought. Cayde remained seated at his desk inside the command hall, processing the massive influx of after-action reports generated by the Lightbearers returning from Saturn. He signed hundreds of administrative datapads, authorizing the distribution of salvaged alien technology and allocating physical currency for ship repairs. He stacked the completed datapads on the corner of his desk, pulling the heavy fabric of his torn brown cloak tight against his shoulders. He reached into his utility pouch and pulled out a small metallic coin etched with a crude, geometric emblem. He flipped the coin across his knuckles, watching the silver metal reflect the blue light of his optical sensors. He kept his jump ship parked in the lower hangars, fully fueled and loaded with heavy kinetic ammunition. He continued to coordinate the hunter scouts across the planetary frontiers, directing their physical patrol routes and intercepting encrypted enemy transmissions. He received an encrypted audio file on his personal datapad originating from an unmarked Vanguard relay station located in the outer system. The transmission contained a heavily distorted voice repeating a specific string of geographic coordinates located in the European Dead Zone on Earth. Cayde listened to the audio file, recognizing the distinct vocal pattern of a high-ranking alien commander previously listed as deceased on the Vanguard bounties. He tapped the glass screen of his datapad, routing the coordinates to a secured tracking program. The program mapped the exact location, pinpointing a massive, heavily fortified concrete bunker built directly into the side of a jagged mountain peak. The tracking program displayed a massive concentration of thermal energy emanating from the bunker, indicating a large-scale manufacturing facility producing high-yield explosive ordnance. Cayde picked up his kinetic hand cannon, slid the weapon into his thigh holster, and walked out of the command hall, leaving the stack of unread datapads sitting on the white stone table. Cayde-6 guided his jump ship through the upper atmosphere of Earth, tracking the encrypted coordinates down to the European Dead Zone. He flew over the ruined highways and the rusted frames of ancient human transport vehicles. He located the jagged mountain peak and the massive concrete bunker built directly into the stone. Two heavily armed alien guards wearing thick red armor stood outside the reinforced steel doors, holding large shrapnel launchers. Cayde landed his ship behind a ridge of tall pine trees. He disembarked, keeping low to the ground and pulling the hood of Andal's brown cloak over his metal head. He drew his kinetic hand cannon and fired 2 precise shots. The high-caliber slugs pierced the guards' helmets, dropping them instantly to the dirt. He walked up to the steel doors, planted an explosive breaching charge against the locking mechanism, and stepped back. The charge detonated, blowing the heavy doors inward and filling the entrance with thick grey smoke. He stepped through the smoke and into the dimly lit bunker. The interior featured long metal corridors, heavy industrial manufacturing equipment, and massive crates stacked high against the concrete walls. Red emergency lights rotated along the ceiling, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor grates. Cayde heard heavy mechanical footsteps echoing from the far end of the corridor. A towering alien figure stepped out of the shadows. The figure wore a thick, dark fur cloak and overlapping plates of scavenged steel. Hydraulic pistons hissed in his mechanical legs. The optical sensors on his mask locked onto the exo. Cayde raised his hand cannon, identifying the physical presence of the mercenary Cayde-6, the Scarred. The alien had returned from his physical death on the lunar surface, rebuilt by his crew with new metal limbs and fresh ether lines. Cayde-6 raised a heavy wire rifle and fired a continuous stream of arc energy down the corridor. Cayde activated his thruster boots, launching his titanium frame sideways into an open maintenance alcove. The arc bolts struck the concrete wall behind him, leaving deep, scorched craters in the stone. Cayde reloaded his cylinder with explosive rounds. He leaned out from the alcove and fired directly at the mercenary's chest plating. The rounds detonated on impact, shredding the scavenged steel armor and pushing Cayde-6 backward. The mercenary recovered instantly, deploying a localized arc energy shield around his mechanical chassis. He aimed a mounted shoulder cannon and fired a heavy plasma mortar into the alcove. The mortar exploded, collapsing the concrete ceiling and burying Cayde under a pile of heavy stone debris. Cayde pushed the heavy concrete blocks off his titanium frame. His carbon joints groaned under the strain. He saw Cayde-6 running toward a heavy cargo elevator at the far end of the facility. Cayde sprinted down the corridor, firing kinetic rounds at the mercenary's exposed back. Cayde-6 stepped onto the elevator platform and activated the lift mechanism. The platform descended rapidly into the lower levels of the bunker. Cayde leaped over the edge of the shaft, plummeting down the dark tunnel. He extended his metal legs and landed heavily on the roof of the descending elevator car. He aimed his hand cannon down through the metal grating and fired his remaining rounds into the mercenary's upper shoulder chassis. Cayde-6 slammed his heavy mechanical fist upward through the grating, striking Cayde's boot and knocking him off balance. The elevator crashed into the lowest level of the bunker. The heavy metal doors slid open, revealing a massive manufacturing floor filled with automated assembly lines and volatile explosive payloads. Cayde rolled off the roof of the car and landed in a crouch on the concrete floor. Cayde-6 stepped out of the elevator, holding a massive arc cannon with both mechanical arms. The weapon hummed with concentrated electrical energy. The mercenary aimed the weapon directly at Cayde and charged the firing mechanism. Cayde holstered his hand cannon. He reached to his belt and pulled a long, jagged hunting knife from its leather sheath. The metal blade hummed with active solar energy, burning brightly in the dim light of the facility. Cayde threw the burning knife directly at the mercenary. The blade cut through the air, completely bypassing the arc energy shield. The knife embedded itself deep into Cayde-6's primary ether manifold, melting the synthetic hoses and igniting the highly volatile gas stored inside the tank. The resulting explosion ripped the mercenary's mechanical torso apart, scattering metal plating and hydraulic fluid across the manufacturing floor. The physical blast wave threw Cayde backward into a stack of heavy wooden crates. He hit the concrete floor and slid to a halt. He stood up, walked over to the smoldering wreckage of the alien, and looked down at the shattered metal mask. He reached down, pulled the burning hunting knife free from the wreckage, and wiped the blade clean on his heavy brown cloak. He walked back to the cargo elevator and rode it to the surface, securing the physical elimination of the mercenary for the second time. Cayde-6 returned to the last city and sat behind the white stone table inside the Vanguard command hall. Heavy drops of water struck the thick glass windows, and grey clouds covered the sky above the earth. Commander Zavala stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the sprawling districts. Ikora Ray sorted through a stack of encrypted data pads. The proximity sensors and the early warning orbital satellites remained completely silent. The holographic projector in the center of the room displayed a steady, uninterrupted green grid. A massive, wedge-shaped spacecraft tore through the dense cloud cover directly above the last city. The ship measured hundreds of meters across and featured thick, dark gray armor plating trimmed with dark red paint. Hundreds of identical warships followed the first vessel, descending rapidly into the lower atmosphere. The ships fired heavy incendiary missiles directly into the stone towers and concrete walls of the last city. The missiles detonated on impact, blowing massive holes in the defensive perimeter and sending showers of shattered stone and twisted rebar down into the residential sectors. The holographic projector on the Vanguard table sparked, short-circuited, and went completely black. Cylindrical metal drop pods launched from the undersides of the red warships. The pods plummeted through the air and crashed into the stone tiles of the Vanguard Plaza. The pressurized hatches blew open. Towering Cabal soldiers stepped out of the pods. They wore heavy pressurized suits of crimson armor and carried massive slug rifles. They fired concentrated micro-rockets at the light-bearers stationed around the courtyard. Cayde drew his kinetic hand cannon from his thigh holster. He activated his thruster boots, launched his titanium frame over the white stone table, and landed on the exterior balcony. He fired high-caliber rounds directly into the exhaust vents on the Cabal soldiers' armor, rupturing their pressurized suits and dropping them to the stone tiles. Zavala generated a solid wall of purple void energy, blocking the incoming micro-rockets. Ikora threw concentrated spheres of electrical arc plasma, melting the Cabal drop pods into pools of liquid slag. Cayde reloaded his hand cannon, ejecting the empty brass casings onto the floor. He looked up at the massive white sphere suspended over the city, a colossal mechanical superstructure deployed from a central Cabal command ship. The structure consisted of massive metal arms and heavy industrial clamps. The mechanical arms extended outward and locked directly onto the surface of the white sphere. The clamps tightened, digging deep into the pale outer shell. The mechanical structure activated, emitting a blinding orange light. A thick energy field spread across the entire surface of the white sphere, encasing it completely in a synthetic cage. The light-bearers fighting in the plaza collapsed simultaneously. Cayde dropped to his metal knees. The internal energy reserves powering his synthetic chassis drained instantly. His carbon joints locked in place, and the glowing blue light in his optical sensors dimmed to a dull gray. His ghost, Sundance, materialized in the air beside him. Her geometric metal shell stopped spinning. She dropped out of the air and hit the stone tiles with a sharp metallic clatter. The purple energy shield generated by Zavala dissolved into thin smoke, and the electrical current flowing through Ikora's hands vanished. The Cabal soldiers advanced across the plaza, firing their slug rifles into the defenseless light-bearers. Cayde reached down with his heavy metal hands and picked up the inert shell of his ghost. He placed Sundance securely inside the utility pouch on his belt. He forced his mechanical legs to move, pushing through the friction of his unpowered joints. He ran back through the shattered glass doors of the command hall. The red warships fired continuous barrages of incendiary missiles into the tower. The explosions tore through the concrete ceilings, setting the wooden tables and synthetic carpets on fire. Cayde navigated through the burning corridors, dodging falling support beams and stepping over the crushed debris. He reached the lower maintenance levels and entered the secondary hangar. Smoke filled the wide room, and warning lights flashed along the walls. A small, unmarked transport skiff sat on the launch pad. Cayde climbed the metal ramp and slid into the pilot's seat. He pressed the ignition sequence on the control console. The sublight engines sputtered, emitted a thick cloud of black exhaust, and ignited. He gripped the steering yoke and pushed the throttle forward. The skiff lifted off the pad, flew through the open hangar doors, and accelerated into the heavy rain. He steered the skiff away from the burning tower and pushed through the Earth's atmosphere into the vacuum of space. He accessed the navigation computer, typing coordinates into the tracking terminal. He bypassed the local defensive grids and charted a direct flight path to the outer edges of the solar system. He locked the targeting telemetry onto a specific celestial body orbiting in the far reaches of space. He pointed the nose of the skiff toward the irregular, copper-colored surface of the centaur known as Nessus, planning to locate advanced Vex teleportation technology hidden deep within the mechanical structure of the planetoid to use against the Cabal fleet. Cayde guided the unmarked transport skiff down through the turbulent atmosphere of Nessus. The hull of the ship scraped against the thick canopy of red-leaved trees and sheared off branches from the ancient petrified wood. He navigated through deep canyons composed of angular, geometric brass and flowing rivers of thick, white radiolarian fluid. He located a wide plateau of flat copper and landed the skiff, leaving the sublight engines idling on a low cycle. He stepped out onto the metal surface, carrying his kinetic hand cannon and a heavy bandolier of explosive charges slung across his chest. He tapped the side of his helmet, establishing a direct, encrypted comms link with his ghost, Sundance, secured deep inside his utility pouch. He walked past towering, rectangular spires of bronze and accessed a central terminal built into the floor. He inserted his silver stylus into the data port, overriding the security protocols with physical brute force. The plateau rumbled, and a massive circular iris opened in the ground, revealing a deep vertical shaft extending directly into the planetoid's core. Cayde stepped off the edge, falling rapidly through the dark tunnel. He engaged his thruster boots near the bottom, decelerating sharply and landing on a grated metal walkway. A sprawling network of glowing blue cables and pulsing energy conduits filled the massive subterranean cavern. Tall, cycloptic mechanical units constructed of bronze and white polymer patrolled the walkways, carrying heavy energy rifles. Cayde sprinted across the metal grates, firing high-caliber rounds from his hand cannon directly into the glowing red optical sensors of the Vex units. He shattered their bronze chassis, stepping over the leaking white fluid and continuing deeper into the facility. He located the central teleporter control node, a massive spire of spinning rings and crackling electrical current. He pulled the explosive charges from his bandolier and planted them against the primary power couplings at the base of the spire. He keyed the detonator on his wrist terminal, triggering a synchronized series of explosions. The blast severed the power cables, plunging the cavern into sudden darkness. The spinning rings ground to a halt, emitting loud screeches of tearing metal. The Vex security protocols engaged, sealing the heavy blast doors at the end of the walkway and deploying a massive, heavily armored Minotaur unit from a hidden alcove. The Minotaur stood 3 times Cayde's height, projecting a dense purple void shield and holding a heavy torch hammer. Cayde reloaded his hand cannon with specialized armor-piercing rounds. He slid across the metal grates, firing directly into the alien's exposed joints. The heavy slugs deflected off the purple shield, leaving Cayde exposed in the center of the walkway. The Minotaur raised its torch hammer and fired a volley of volatile void mortar shells. Cayde activated a localized teleportation matrix built into his belt, shifting his physical location 5 meters to the right. The mortar shells detonated on his previous position, tearing a massive hole in the metal walkway and sending a shower of burning shrapnel across the cavern. Cayde leaped over the gap in the walkway, closing the distance to the Minotaur. He unholstered a heavy combat knife and drove the blade directly into the energy projector mounted on the alien's shoulder. The shield generator sparked and overloaded, dropping the purple barrier. Cayde pressed the barrel of his hand cannon against the Minotaur's glowing red eye and pulled the trigger. The armor-piercing round shattered the optical sensor and detonated inside the central processor core. The massive bronze frame collapsed onto the walkway, leaking thick white fluid from its ruptured chassis. Cayde stepped back from the destroyed Vex unit and looked at the deactivated teleporter control node. He pulled a thick data cable from his utility pouch, connected it to the base of the spire, and plugged the opposite end directly into the port on his wrist terminal. He initiated a manual override sequence, forcing the teleporter to spin back up using the residual energy stored inside the severed power couplings. The rings rotated slowly, generating a weak, unstable portal in the center of the spire. The portal flickered rapidly between bright blue and a dull, static-filled white. Cayde checked the readouts on his wrist terminal, confirming the portal's destination locked onto the Cabal command ship, hovering over the last city. He holstered his hand cannon, adjusted the collar of Andal's torn brown cloak, and stepped forward into the unstable energy field. Cayde stepped out of the portal and directly onto the polished metal deck of the Cabal command ship, hovering over the last city. The air inside the vessel felt hot and heavy, smelling of burned engine fuel and thick metallic grease. Rows of armored Cabal soldiers stood in strict formation across the hangar bay, loading massive slug rifles and checking the pressure seals on their crimson armor suits. Cayde drew his kinetic hand cannon and fired a rapid sequence of high-caliber rounds. The heavy slugs pierced the thick armor plating on the soldiers' chests, knocking them backward against the metal bulkheads. The remaining soldiers raised their rifles and returned fire. Concentrated volleys of micro-rockets struck the deck around Cayde, tearing holes in the metal grating and sending shrapnel flying through the air. He activated his thruster boots, launching his titanium frame upward to an elevated catwalk overlooking the hangar. He holstered his hand cannon and unslung a heavy sniper rifle from his back. He leaned against the metal railing, tracking the movements of the Cabal commanders through his optical scope. He fired armor-piercing rounds directly into the exhaust vents on their pressurized suits, dropping them one by one to the hangar floor. Sirens blared through the corridors, and heavy blast doors slid shut, sealing the hangar bay from the rest of the ship. Cayde dropped the empty sniper rifle onto the catwalk and pulled the jagged hunting knife from his belt. He engaged a localized teleportation matrix built into his armor, shifting his physical location directly behind a massive Cabal Centurion holding a heavy projection rifle. Cayde drove the solar-charged blade into the gap between the Centurion's neck armor and helmet, severing the primary life support tubes and dropping the massive alien to the deck. He sprinted through the ship, navigating the wide metal corridors and moving toward the central command bridge. He encountered heavy resistance at every intersection, fighting through squads of armored soldiers and massive automated defense turrets mounted on the ceilings. He utilized the physical environment for cover, sliding behind thick metal pillars and utilizing explosive trip mines to clear the crowded hallways. He reached the heavy steel doors of the command bridge and planted a shaped explosive charge directly onto the locking mechanism. The charge detonated, blowing the doors inward and filling the bridge with thick smoke. The leader of the Cabal forces, Dominus Gaul, stood at the center of the bridge. Gaul possessed a massive physical frame encased in thick white and gold armor. A heavy mechanical harness attached directly to his back, connecting his armor to a stolen Vanguard energy siphon. Gaul absorbed raw, concentrated light from the massive white sphere suspended outside the ship's viewport, channeling the energy into his own biological system. His white armor glowed with a blinding ethereal light, and thick arcs of electricity snapped across his gauntlets. Cayde raised his hand cannon and fired directly at the glowing energy siphon on Gaul's back. The kinetic rounds deflected harmlessly off the thick armor plating. Gaul raised his hand, projecting a massive wave of solid void energy across the bridge. The wave struck Cayde, throwing him backward through the shattered doors and into the corridor. Cayde hit the metal wall, denting his titanium shoulder plating and cracking the glass lenses on his optical sensors. He pushed himself off the floor, drawing a heavy shotgun from his back. He pumped the slide, loading a high-yield incendiary shell into the chamber. He ran back onto the bridge, firing the shotgun repeatedly at the massive Cabal leader. The incendiary rounds exploded against Gaul's armor, filling the room with thick smoke and the smell of burning metal. Gaul ignored the explosions. He channeled the stolen light, manifesting a massive, burning sword constructed entirely of pure solar energy. He swung the blade in a wide arc, slicing cleanly through the metal consoles and support pillars on the bridge. Cayde ducked under the blade, feeling the intense heat radiate against his metal chassis. He reloaded his hand cannon, aiming directly at the exposed mechanical joints on Gaul's legs. He fired a rapid sequence of shots, shattering the servos and forcing the massive alien onto one knee. Cayde leaped into the air, drawing his solar-charged hunting knife. He drove the blade directly into the energy siphon mounted on Gaul's back. The siphon sparked and overloaded, severing the connection to the massive white sphere outside. The sudden loss of energy caused a catastrophic chain reaction within Gaul's armor. The stolen light violently rejected its artificial container, erupting outward in a blinding flash of pure energy. The physical blast wave consumed Gaul's biological body entirely, reducing the massive alien to white ash. The shockwave threw Cayde backward across the bridge. He slammed into the reinforced glass viewport, shattering the thick pane. He fell backward out of the ship, plummeting through the heavy rain and dark clouds directly toward the ruined streets of the last city below. Cayde hit the slanted tin roof of a ruined residential building in the last city, rolling across the corrugated metal and crashing into the brick chimney. He slid down the steep pitch and dropped onto the muddy street below. He landed on his back, cracking his titanium chest plate and snapping the hydraulic lines in his left arm. The white ash from the explosion settled over the city, sticking to the wet pavement and coating the shattered glass of the storefronts. Cayde pushed himself up onto his knees, gripping the rusted bumper of an overturned transport truck. He reached into his utility pouch and pulled out the physical shell of his ghost, Sundance. He pressed his metal thumb against the center of the geometric shell, attempting to force the internal mechanics to reactivate. The metal remained cold and unresponsive. The heavy red warships maintained their position above the city, firing continuous barrages of incendiary missiles into the remaining defensive fortifications. The explosions sent thick plumes of black smoke rising into the rain. Tall Cabal soldiers marched down the flooded streets, projecting heavy energy shields from their gauntlets and firing slug rifles into the rubble. Cayde leaned against the truck bumper, pulling his kinetic hand cannon from his holster. He checked the cylinder, rotating the metal drum with his thumb. Only 2 physical rounds remained in the chambers. He clicked the cylinder back into place and pointed the barrel down the street. A group of heavily armored light-bearers moved through the alleyways, firing kinetic rifles and throwing volatile grenades at the advancing Cabal units. Commander Zavala walked at the front of the formation, carrying a massive automatic rifle and projecting a wide, dome-shaped shield of purple void energy. Ikora Ray flanked him, firing concentrated bursts of electrical arc plasma from her hands. They moved methodically, securing the civilian evacuation routes and pushing the hostile forces back toward the central plaza. Zavala saw Cayde leaning against the truck and ordered the fire team to halt. He lowered the void shield, walked over to the exo, and looked down at the leaking hydraulic lines and the cracked chest plate. Zavala extended his massive blue hand and pulled Cayde to his feet. Cayde placed Sundance back into his pouch and holstered his hand cannon. He limped beside Zavala, dragging his left leg through the mud. They followed the fire team through the city streets, navigating the debris and avoiding the primary engagement zones. They reached the massive steel gates marking the outer perimeter of the last city. Thousands of unarmored civilians crowded the exit tunnels, carrying canvas bags and pulling small metal carts filled with physical supplies. The light-bearers formed a defensive line around the gates, covering the evacuation with overlapping fields of suppressing fire. Cayde stood near the heavy steel doors, using his functioning right arm to help load the heavy supply crates onto the transport skiffs. The last transport skiff launched from the staging area, carrying the remaining civilians away from the burning city. Zavala issued a general retreat order, commanding the light-bearers to abandon the perimeter and fall back to the designated rendezvous point in the European dead zone. The light-bearers boarded their sparrows and accelerated out of the gates, leaving the ruined city to the occupying Cabal forces. Cayde climbed onto the back of a heavy cargo speeder, driven by Ikora Ray. The speeder hovered over the cracked asphalt, the repulsor engines whining under the combined weight. They drove through the dense forests and the winding mountain passes, moving steadily toward the encrypted coordinates of the Vanguard rally point. They arrived at the farm, an abandoned agricultural settlement located deep within the European dead zone. Rusted tractors and broken irrigation pipes littered the muddy fields. The light-bearers established a temporary command center inside a large wooden barn, setting up encrypted communication terminals and mapping the physical layout of the Cabal occupation forces on physical paper charts. Cayde sat on an overturned wooden crate near the barn doors. He unbolted the cracked titanium plating from his chest, exposing the complex mechanical wiring underneath. He pulled the small rectangular paper journal from the hidden cavity. The edges of the paper were singed, and the thick leather binding was completely charred. He opened the cover and traced the faded graphite letters spelling the name, Ace. He looked at the red ink drawings of the Queen of Hearts and the Ace of Spades, noting the dark scorch marks overlapping the symbols. He placed the journal flat on his lap, picked up his graphite pen, and began documenting the precise physical details of the massive white sphere trapped inside the alien energy cage. Cayde-6 spent several orbital cycles sitting inside the dark, wooden barn in the European dead zone. He watched the light-bearers unpack salvaged Vanguard tracking terminals from the transport skiffs and connect them to portable fusion generators. The terminals flickered on, establishing weak communication links across the solar system. The screens displayed massive concentrations of Cabal warships spreading throughout the inner planets. The physical cage surrounding the massive white sphere above Earth remained fully active, blocking the light and keeping the light-bearers in a continuous state of physical exhaustion. Cayde walked outside the barn, his mechanical legs sinking into the wet mud of the agricultural fields. He stood in the pouring rain, holding the physical shell of his ghost, Sundance, tightly in his metal hand. The geometric casing remained cold, and the central mechanical eye showed zero signs of internal power. A specific tracking program running on the central terminal inside the barn suddenly emitted a sharp, repetitive tone. A cloaked hunter lightbearer sprinted out of the barn and handed Cayde a printed paper readout. The readout confirmed a direct physical breach inside the Cabal cage surrounding the massive white sphere. The tracking data indicated a single light-bearer had successfully regained a direct connection to the light, restoring their physical capabilities and regenerating their ghost. Cayde reviewed the data, identifying the specific engine signature of the light-bearer's jump ship. The signature belonged to the same operative who had disabled the primary weapon array on the bone-white dreadnought and eliminated the mercenary Tanix on the lunar surface. Cayde loaded heavy kinetic ammunition into his thigh holster and packed a thick canvas bag with explosive trip mines. He strapped the heavy bag across his back and boarded an unmarked transport skiff. He navigated the skiff away from the farm, charting a course back to the jagged surface of the Centaur Nessus. He located the massive concrete bunker built into the side of the mountain and landed his ship near the shattered steel doors. He infiltrated the manufacturing facility, utilizing his internal optical sensors to bypass the automated security grids. He retrieved the specialized teleporter control node he had previously reactivated, carrying the heavy bronze and white polymer device out of the subterranean cavern and loading it into the cargo hold of his skiff. He flew the skiff directly toward the last city, breaking through the dense cloud cover and avoiding the heavy anti-air artillery fire from the Cabal warships. He located a narrow vertical maintenance shaft built into the concrete outer wall of the city. He landed the skiff, pulled the heavy teleporter node from the cargo hold, and carried the device into the dark tunnel. He climbed the rusted iron ladders, ascending hundreds of meters toward the upper levels of the occupied city. He emerged through a heavy steel grate and stepped onto the polished stone tiles of the Vanguard Command Plaza. Cabal soldiers patrolled the area, carrying heavy slug rifles and projecting void energy shields. The massive central command ship hovered directly over the plaza, connected to the cage surrounding the white sphere by thick mechanical arms. Cayde set the teleporter node down on the stone tiles, hiding the device behind a shattered concrete planter. He pulled the thick copper wires from his utility pouch and connected the node to the remaining electrical current running through the ruined plaza. He calibrated the targeting telemetry, locking the destination coordinates directly onto the bridge of the Cabal command ship. He sent an encrypted transmission to the single light bearer with restored power, detailing the exact location of the teleporter and the specific layout of the alien vessel. He drew his kinetic hand cannon and stepped out from behind the concrete planter. He fired a rapid sequence of high-caliber rounds at the Cabal patrols, drawing their physical attention away from the teleporter node. The soldiers turned and fired their slug rifles, tearing chunks of stone out of the plaza tiles. Cayde retreated down a narrow alleyway, throwing explosive trip mines onto the walls to block their pursuit. He heard the distinct mechanical whine of the teleporter node activating, followed by the immediate, concussive sounds of a heavy firefight erupting on the bridge of the command ship above. He holstered his weapon and leaned against the brick wall of the alleyway, tracking the massive explosions rocking the upper levels of the alien vessel. The physical cage surrounding the white sphere shattered, sending a blinding wave of pure light expanding across the city, instantly reigniting the blue glow in his optical sensors and reviving the cold metal shell of the ghost resting in his pouch. Cayde-6 stood in the muddy fields of the farm, listening to the heavy thrum of transport skiffs launching from the clearing. He checked the cylinder of his hand cannon, clicking the full drum into place. He wrapped the heavy fabric of Andal's cloak tightly around his chest and boarded a skiff alongside Commander Zavala and Ikora Ray. The light-bearers returned to the last city in force, dropping from their ships and landing directly in the flooded streets. They moved methodically, clearing the remaining Cabal patrols with overlapping fields of kinetic fire and localized void explosions. Cayde advanced down a ruined avenue, firing armor-piercing rounds through the chest plates of the crimson-armored soldiers and dropping them onto the cracked asphalt. They secured the Vanguard command hall, tossing the shattered stone tiles out the massive glass windows and re-establishing the encrypted communication relays. The holographic projector powered on, displaying a green grid covering the entire solar system. Cayde sat at the white stone table, reviewing the planetary scans. The Cabal invasion force retreated, pulling their heavy red warships out of the atmosphere and establishing fortified bases on the outer planets. Cayde picked up his silver stylus, loaded a series of physical bounties onto his datapad, and transmitted the targets to the hunter scouts operating across the system. He placed the heavy hand cannon on the table and leaned back in the dark leather chair. Months passed, turning into consecutive solar years. The light-bearers rebuilt the defensive walls of the last city, pouring thick concrete over the damaged steel rebar. Cayde monitored the physical borders, tracking the movements of alien scavengers and deploying fire teams to eliminate emerging threats. A new crisis emerged from the tangled, overgrown ruins of the reef, the sovereign territory of the Awoken, located deep in the asteroid belt. The Vanguard received an encrypted distress signal originating from the Prison of Elders, a massive, maximum security detention facility built entirely inside a hollowed-out asteroid. Cayde mobilized immediately. He walked down to the hangars and boarded a heavy transport skiff. He traveled to the reef alongside an Awoken guardian named Petra Venge, the field commander of the Queen's forces. Petra wore sleek purple armor and carried a curved kinetic dagger on her belt. They landed the skiff on a suspended landing pad attached to the exterior hull of the prison. The massive steel blast doors separating the pad from the cell blocks hung completely open. Warning sirens blared through the metal corridors, and thick black smoke poured out from the ventilation shafts. Cayde and Petra entered the prison. The interior corridors featured grated metal floors suspended over deep, bottomless shafts. Thick chains hung from the ceilings, and the electronic locking mechanisms on thousands of individual containment cells sparked with short-circuiting electrical current. The alien inmates rioted, tearing the heavy steel doors off their hinges and flooding the hallways. Cayde drew his hand cannon and fired directly into the charging crowds, dropping massive Cabal gladiators and heavily modified fallen mercenaries. Petra moved beside him, slicing through the alien armor with her combat knife and firing precise rounds from a lightweight sidearm. They pushed deeper into the facility, descending toward the lowest level, known as the Supermax block. They stood on a narrow metal walkway overlooking a massive central hub. 8 massive containment pods circled the hub, each one secured with heavy magnetic locks and thick titanium bracing. The locking mechanisms on these specific pods flashed red, and the thick metal doors hissed open. The occupants of the pods stepped out onto the hub. They were the Scorned Barons, a group of powerful alien warlords heavily mutated by corrupted ether. They possessed massive, asymmetrical mechanical limbs, carried crude bladed weapons, and emitted a thick, dark purple smoke from their armor joints. The Barons immediately focused their physical attention on the two light-bearers. Cayde reloaded his cylinder with explosive rounds. He activated his thruster boots, launching his titanium frame off the walkway and dropping directly into the center of the hub. He landed heavily on the metal deck, firing his hand cannon rapidly at the surrounding warlords. The explosive rounds shattered their crude armor plating, but the corrupted ether circulating through their systems instantly regenerated the damaged tissue. Petra remained on the elevated walkway, providing covering fire with her sidearm. The Barons overwhelmed Cayde with sheer physical mass. A towering warlord carrying a massive mechanical flail swung the weapon in a wide arc. The heavy iron-spiked ball struck Cayde directly in the chest, crushing his titanium plating and throwing him backward into a concrete support pillar. He hit the stone and collapsed onto the metal grates. The Barons closed the distance, surrounding the exo. Cayde raised his hand cannon, aiming at the nearest warlord. A second Baron stepped forward, holding a high-caliber sniper rifle scavenged from a fallen light-bearer. The Baron pressed the barrel directly against the physical shell of Cayde's ghost, Sundance, hovering just above his shoulder. The Baron pulled the trigger. The armor-piercing round shattered the geometric metal shell and destroyed the mechanical eye. Sundance exploded in a shower of sparks and broken polymer. The light within the cavern instantly dimmed. Cayde felt the internal connection to the light sever completely. The physical damage to his chest plate throbbed with a cold, hollow ache. He dragged himself backward against the concrete pillar, gripping the handle of his hand cannon with his functioning right arm. He pointed the barrel at the sniper, locking his optical sensors onto the alien's face. He pulled the trigger, firing the last kinetic round directly into the warlord's eye, and dropped the empty weapon onto the metal grate. Cayde-6 picked up the restored shell of Sundance, sliding the metal casing back into the utility pouch on his belt. The blue light in his optical sensors burned brightly as he walked across the shattered glass of the command bridge. He stepped over the scorched metal remains of the Cabal leader and climbed the twisted steel stairs leading to the upper observation deck. He looked through the massive viewport, watching the dense energy field encasing the white sphere completely dissipate. The light-bearers, fighting in the plaza below, reignited their void shields and solar blades, pushing the disorganized Cabal soldiers back toward their drop pods. Cayde drew his kinetic hand cannon and fired high-caliber rounds down into the fleeing squads, covering the light-bearers' advance. The vanguard reclaimed the last city over the following weeks. Commander Zavala directed the reconstruction of the shattered concrete walls, and a core array re-established the encrypted communication relays inside the command hall. Cayde sat at the circular white stone table, reviewing physical bounties and tracking the movements of alien scavengers across the outer colonies. The massive prison of elders, located in the asteroid belt of the reef, required continuous physical monitoring following the massive riot. Cayde delegated regular patrols to the Hunter Scouts, instructing them to map the metal corridors and secure the heavy blast doors containing the most dangerous alien criminals. He received a physical summons encoded on a standard datapad, requesting his immediate presence at the reef. The transmission originated directly from Petra Venge. He packed a canvas duffel bag with heavy kinetic ammunition and explosive trip mines, leaving the stack of administrative reports sitting untouched on the Vanguard table. He launched his jump ship from the primary hangar and navigated through the dense asteroid fields. He docked his vessel on the metal landing pad attached to the exterior of the prison. Petra waited for him near the primary airlock, wearing her purple armor and carrying her curved dagger. They entered the facility and descended the heavy cargo elevators. The lower containment levels housed the most violent inmates, including a specific group of fallen mercenaries known as the Scorned Barons. These barons operated under the direct command of an awoken prince named Uldren Sov, the brother of the awoken queen. Uldren had surrendered his physical freedom to the prison, locking himself inside the lowest containment cell to coordinate the barons from within. The alarm sirens suddenly blared through the metal corridors, and the heavy security grates sealing the lower levels lifted. Cayde and Petra sprinted down the grated metal walkways. The electronic locking mechanisms on the cell doors sparked and hissed open. The Scorned Barons stepped out onto the central hub. They carried massive mechanical flails, heavy wire rifles, and large shrapnel launchers. Uldren Sov walked out of his cell behind them, holding a lightweight kinetic sidearm. The barons raised their weapons and fired a concentrated volley of high-explosive rounds directly at the elevated walkway. The explosions shattered the steel bracing, collapsing the walkway and dropping Cayde and Petra down into the center of the hub. Cayde landed heavily on the metal deck, firing his hand cannon rapidly at the surrounding warlords. He activated his thruster boots, launching his titanium frame over the swinging mechanical flails. He landed behind a towering baron and fired a precise round directly into the alien's heavy ether tank. The tank ruptured, spraying volatile gas into the air. A second baron raised a high-caliber sniper rifle and fired. The armor-piercing round struck Cayde's hand cannon, shattering the metal cylinder and knocking the weapon from his grasp. The barons overwhelmed the Exo, striking his titanium plating with crude blades and heavy metal clubs. Cayde collapsed onto his knees, his carbon joints grinding under the physical pressure. Sundance materialized in the air beside him, scanning his chassis for internal damage and preparing to initiate the healing protocols. The sniper fired a second round. The heavy bullet struck Sundance directly in her central lens, shattering the geometric shell and completely destroying the ghost. The blue light in Cayde's optical sensors flickered. The physical connection to the light severed instantly, leaving him entirely dependent on his remaining synthetic fluids and mechanical systems. Uldren Sov walked across the metal hub, his boots clanking against the grates. He stopped directly in front of Cayde, looking down at the damaged Exo. Uldren reached down and picked up the shattered remnants of Cayde's hand cannon. The metal cylinder was broken, but a single physical round remained lodged inside the chamber. Uldren pointed the barrel of the ruined weapon directly at Cayde's metal faceplate. He pulled the trigger. The kinetic slug pierced the titanium armor, embedding itself deep inside Cayde's central processor core. The blue light in his optical sensors faded to a dull, permanent gray, and his heavy metal frame collapsed onto the steel deck. The Vanguard fire teams arrived at the Prison of Elders hours after the initial transmission, deploying from their jump ships and dropping directly onto the central hub. They found the massive metal doors of the Supermax cell blocks completely open and the corridors empty. They found the physical body of Cayde-6 lying on the metal grating. The light-bearers lifted the heavy titanium frame and carried it back to their transport skiffs, securing the body inside the cargo bay. They flew back to the last city and placed the Exo on a wide stone slab in the center of the Vanguard command hall. Commander Zavala and Ikora Ray stood silently over the table. The blue light in Cayde's optical sensors remained extinguished, and the internal cooling fans inside his chassis were completely still. Ikora placed a thick, woven white cloth over his ruined chest plate, covering the massive puncture wound. The light-bearers who recovered Cayde returned to the reef, deploying heavily armed fire teams across the asteroid belt. They tracked the distinct ether trails left by the Scorn Barons, locating their hidden encampments inside the hollowed-out rocks. The light-bearers engaged the Barons in close-quarters combat, utilizing heavy shotguns and concentrated void explosives to shatter their mechanical armor. They systematically eliminated the 8 warlords, burning their physical remains to prevent the corrupted ether from regenerating their tissue. They traced the final encrypted transmission back to an awoken watchtower located on the edge of the reef. They infiltrated the tower and cornered Uldren Sov in the upper observation deck. Uldren held his lightweight sidearm, standing near the edge of a shattered viewport. The light-bearers raised their kinetic weapons and fired simultaneously. The rounds struck Uldren in the chest, dropping the awoken prince to the metal floor and concluding the Vanguard's physical retaliation. The physical frame of Cayde-6 remained resting on the white stone slab in the command hall. The Vanguard initiated a formal memorial protocol. Zavala ordered the placement of a heavy bronze plaque onto the floor tiles near the Vanguard table, etching the shape of the Ace of Spades into the metal surface. Ikora Rey gathered Cayde's physical possessions from his private quarters, packing his scattered bounties, hand-drawn maps, and boxes of heavy ammunition into a steel footlocker. She picked up the small, charred paper journal he had carried inside his chest plate. She opened the cover, scanned the graphite letters spelling the name Ace, and placed the book carefully on top of the ammunition boxes. She locked the footlocker and slid it underneath the stone table. Months passed, and the solar seasons changed. The thick grey clouds above the earth broke, allowing the sun to shine directly onto the concrete walls of the last city. The light-bearers continued their patrols across the solar system, discovering hidden Golden Age facilities on Europa and engaging new hostile factions in the swamps of the European Dead Zone. The massive white sphere suspended over the city began to physically shift. The thick, geometric fragments of its shattered outer shell started to spin, rotating slowly around the central core. The fragments emitted a continuous, low-frequency hum, vibrating the glass windows in the command hall and sending small tremors through the concrete foundation of the city walls. The Vanguard deployed a fleet of interceptors to monitor the sphere from low orbit. The pilots transmitted live tactical feeds directly to Zavala and Ikora Rey. The white shell fragments accelerated their rotation, blurring into a solid ring of blinding light. The central core of the sphere pulsed with concentrated energy, projecting a massive, triangular portal directly into the vacuum of space in front of the last city. The portal measured thousands of kilometers across, glowing with a deep, unnatural pink energy. A single, angular black ship emerged from the portal. This vessel dwarfed the previous tetrahedron ships, and its massive shadow fell directly over the Earth. The Vanguard sensors identified the specific energy signature radiating from the ship, matching it to the hostile entity known as the Witness, the physical manifestation of the darkness. The triangular portal remained open, crackling with pink energy. The massive black ship entered Earth's atmosphere, hovering silently just above the clouds. The Vanguard forces launched a coordinated strike, firing heavy plasma torpedoes and concentrated solar lasers directly at the vessel. The weapons impacted an invisible barrier surrounding the ship, detonating harmlessly in the air. The Witness projected a focused beam of dark energy from the nose of the ship, striking the white sphere directly in the center. The impact carved a massive, perfectly circular hole into the shell, exposing a swirling tunnel of pink energy leading deep inside the traveler. The light-bearers, operating in the Vanguard Command Hall, felt the immediate, physical drain on their internal energy reserves. The blue glow of the holographic projectors flickered and died, leaving the room in dim twilight. The light-bearers watched the massive black ship drift slowly into the circular hole, entering the physical interior of the traveler and sealing the tunnel behind it. The light-bearers, operating in the Vanguard Command Hall, stood paralyzed. They watched the massive black ship enter the circular tunnel carved into the traveler. Commander Zavala stared at the inert holographic projector on the table. Ikora Ray pulled a small, physical radio receiver from her robes and tuned it to the encrypted Vanguard frequencies. The receiver emitted only static. The light-bearers across the solar system lost their physical connection to the light. Their void shields dropped, their solar blades extinguished, and their ghosts fell to the ground, completely unresponsive. The massive white sphere, suspended over the last city, hung silently in the air, the jagged edges of the circular hole smoking with dark, pink energy. The witness had bypassed the planetary defenses, breached the physical shell of the traveler, and severed the flow of light to the Guardian population. The Vanguard forces retreated from their forward operating bases on Mars, Venus, and Europa. They piloted their jump ships back to the last city using manual navigation coordinates and analog propulsion systems. They landed their ships in the crowded hangars, carrying their offline ghosts in canvas pouches and leather satchels. They gathered inside the Vanguard Command Hall, relying entirely on physical ammunition, scavenged alien technology, and raw physical strength. Zavala organized the remaining fire teams, assigning them to fortify the lower levels of the city walls and establish defensive perimeters around the residential sectors. He authorized the immediate deployment of the heavy armories, unlocking the subterranean vaults and distributing thousands of kinetic rifles, shotguns, and rocket launchers to the unpowered light-bearers. Ikora Ray established a temporary intelligence center inside the dusty sublevels beneath the command hall. She utilized physical maps, analog radio receivers, and direct visual reconnaissance provided by the remaining Hunter scouts. The scouts infiltrated the outer edges of the solar system, observing the massive fleet of triangular black ships holding their positions in orbit around the distant planets. The scouts returned to the last city, delivering hand-drawn maps detailing the exact physical locations of the alien vessels. Ikora analyzed the data, noting the lack of direct physical aggression from the Black Fleet. The ships simply hovered in the atmosphere, projecting thick fields of localized gravity and freezing the surrounding environments. The true physical danger emanated entirely from the circular hole torn into the traveler above the city. A single light-bearer stood apart from the defensive preparations. This operative bypassed the crowded hangars and the fortified walls. This operative walked directly to a small, unmarked transport skiff parked on a secluded landing pad near the edge of the city. This light-bearer held the unique physical capability to manipulate a different form of energy, a power derived from the darkness itself. They utilized a physical subclass known as Strand, weaving thick ropes of green, fibrous energy from the atmosphere. They projected a grappling hook constructed of this green energy, securing the line to the physical hull of the skiff and pulling themselves into the cockpit. The light-bearer ignited the sublight engines and launched the skiff into the sky. They bypassed the standard atmospheric flight paths, pointing the nose of the ship directly toward the massive white sphere suspended overhead. They accelerated through the thick clouds, approaching the circular hole smoking with pink energy. The light bearer engaged the strand energy, forming a dense, woven shield around the exterior hull of the skiff. The ship breached the threshold of the tunnel, passing directly through the pink energy field and entering the physical interior of the traveler. The interior space defied physical dimensions. The light bearer parked the skiff on a floating platform constructed of smooth, pale stone. The environment consisted of massive geometric structures, floating islands of white marble, and twisting pathways composed of woven light. The air smelled of ozone and petrified wood. The light bearer disembarked from the ship, carrying a heavy kinetic pulse rifle. They walked across the stone platform, observing the massive roots of a pale, monolithic tree extending outward into the void. The light bearer reached into their utility pouch and pulled out the inert physical shell of their ghost. The geometric casing remained cold, but the central mechanical eye emitted a faint, flickering blue light. The ambient energy inside the traveler slowly recharged the ghost's internal power cells, bypassing the severing effect of the witness and restoring a partial connection to the light. The light bearer secured the ghost back inside the pouch. They walked toward the edge of the stone platform, looking down at a lower pathway winding through a dense thicket of pale roots. A physical figure sat on a smooth stone bench near the base of the massive tree. The figure wore a torn brown cloak over a crushed titanium chest plate. The light bearer raised the pulse rifle, recognizing the specific armor configuration and the faded white paint on the metal chassis. They lowered the weapon and walked slowly down the pathway, approaching the familiar physical frame of Cayde-6. The light bearer approached the smooth stone bench at the base of the pale tree. Cayde-6 sat completely motionless, his metallic hands resting flat against his knees. A jagged hole punctured the center of his chest plating, exposing severed hydraulic lines and shattered carbon joints. The faint blue light, typical of his optical sensors, remained entirely absent, replaced by a dull, flat gray. The light bearer gripped the heavy pulse rifle tightly, scanning the surrounding geometry for any sign of movement. The air hung perfectly still, carrying no scent of the ozone or burning metal that usually accompanied combat. The light bearer slung the pulse rifle over their shoulder and reached out to touch the cold metal of Cayde's shoulder armor. A sudden flash of golden solar energy erupted from the center of Cayde's ruined chest plate. The light expanded outward in a physical shockwave, pushing the light bearer backward onto the stone pathway. The light intensified, weaving bright strands of thermal energy through the severed hydraulic lines and the crushed titanium armor. The metal shifted and repaired itself, sealing the jagged hole completely. The thick leather fabric of Andalbrask's cloak re-stitched its torn edges, pulling tightly over Cayde's shoulders. The dull gray glass in his optical sensors flared to life, burning with a vivid, piercing blue light. Cayde-6 pushed himself off the stone bench, his metal boots clanking loudly against the white marble. He looked down at his intact chest plating and flexed the fully functional servos in his wrists. He reached into his utility pouch and pulled out the reconstructed shell of his ghost. Sundance hovered in the air beside his shoulder, her geometric shell spinning smoothly and her central eye glowing bright blue. Cayde looked up at the light bearer standing on the pathway. He drew his kinetic hand cannon, spun it around his index finger, and slid it into his thigh holster. He activated his vocal processors and emitted a sharp, synthesized laugh. He recognized the light bearer instantly, recalling the encrypted communications and the physical coordinates shared during the assault on the Cabal command ship. He reached out with his metal hand, clapping the light bearer hard on the shoulder plate. The two of them walked together along the twisting pathways of woven light. Cayde moved with his characteristic loose, fluid gait, unbothered by the physics-defying gravity of the traveler's interior. He carried his hand cannon low on his thigh, keeping his optical senses trained on the dense thickets of pale roots. He explained his physical state, confirming that the light inside the traveler had reconstructed his synthetic chassis and rebooted his central processor core. He pulled the charred paper journal from his chest cavity, flipping through the pages to show the physical ink drawings of the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts. He described his intent to assist the vanguard in repelling the massive black ship occupying the traveler, loading heavy incendiary rounds into his hand cannon cylinder as he spoke. They reached a wide circular platform overlooking a massive chasm of dark, swirling pink energy. At the center of the platform stood a tall figure wearing heavy, dark robes and carrying a curved wooden staff. The figure possessed pale, gray skin and solid black eyes. He identified himself as Crow, formerly known as Uldren Sov. He explained that a ghost had found his body following the events in the Awoken Watchtower, reviving him as a light-bearer and completely erasing his previous memories. Cayde stopped walking and stared at Crow. The blue light in Cayde's optical sensors intensified. He reached for the handle of his hand cannon, his metal fingers gripping the grip tightly. He replayed the final video file stored in his memory drives. He saw the awoken prince standing over him in the prison hub, holding the stolen hand cannon and pulling the trigger. Cayde looked at the physical face of the man standing on the platform. He processed the information regarding Crow's resurrection and the subsequent memory wipe. He released his grip on the hand cannon, letting his metal arm hang loosely at his side. He acknowledged the Vanguard's rules regarding resurrected light-bearers, accepting that the physical entity known as Uldren Sov had died in the reef. He walked past Crow without drawing his weapon, keeping his optical sensors focused on the swirling pink energy filling the chasm ahead of them. The three light-bearers joined forces, coordinating their physical movements to navigate the hazardous terrain. They moved across floating stone pillars and through dense thickets of woven light, heading directly toward the massive black ship anchored deep within the traveler's core. Cayde provided covering fire, launching explosive trip mines to clear the path of hostile constructs generated by the witness. He relied on the physical weight of his hand cannon and the steady hum of his optical sensors, utilizing his resurrected frame to push the front line forward. He moved constantly, refusing to remain stationary, and keeping his titanium chassis focused entirely on the physical objective. Cayde-6, Crow, and the light-bearer marched along the wide stone pathway. The pale roots beneath their boots transitioned into cracked gray asphalt. Rusted metal light poles and the oxidized husks of ancient automobiles lined the road. The physical matter inside the traveler replicated the exact structural layout of the cosmodrome on Earth. Patches of green grass grew through the broken pavement. Cayde identified a massive, rusted colony ship resting against a nearby cliffside. The ship bore the exact scorch marks and stripped hull plating he observed during his early border patrols centuries prior. The light-bearer loaded a fresh magazine into the kinetic pulse rifle. Crow walked ahead, holding a glowing solar hand cannon. Cayde walked beside the rusted vehicles, running his titanium fingers over the peeling paint. He found a small metal lockbox sitting on the hood of a car. He flipped the heavy metal latch and opened the lid. The box contained a stack of physical glimmer coins and a deck of faded playing cards. He picked up the deck and thumbed through the paper cards, verifying the frayed edges and bent corners of his personal stash hidden centuries ago. The physical environment inside the traveler extracted data from their internal memory banks, constructing solid, tangible terrain from their stored files. The physical road curved upward, and the rusted cars gave way to smooth white stone tiles. Sections of the Vanguard command hall emerged from the soil. The circular table where Zavala and Ikora Ray usually stood sat embedded at a steep angle in the side of a dirt mound. Cayde walked up to the tilted table. He placed his metal hand on the stone surface, finding the exact scratch marks left by his kinetic hand cannon. Thick black roots and sharp rectangular panes of dark glass pierced the white stone. These geometric intrusions physically bisected the recreated architecture, indicating the exact borders of the corruption introduced by the witness. A high-pitched, vibrating screech echoed from the sky above the asphalt. Flying creatures with leathery wings and elongated bone structures descended from the thick clouds. These creatures carried rapid-fire projectile weapons in their lower claws. They fired volleys of kinetic spikes at the three light-bearers. The spikes struck the stone tiles, punching deep holes into the white masonry and shattering the nearby glass displays. Cayde drew his hand cannon and fired high-caliber rounds at the flying creatures. The heavy slugs tore through their leathery wings, dropping them onto the cracked pavement. Crow threw a concentrated sphere of solar plasma, incinerating a cluster of the flying units in a bright orange flash. The light-bearer fired the pulse rifle, shattering the bone armor of the remaining aerial targets. Tall, bipedal figures stepped out from behind the tilted Vanguard table. These alien soldiers wore dark, geometric armor plating and possessed elongated, asymmetrical skulls. They carried tall metal staves crackling with green strand energy and dark blue stasis crystals. A soldier slammed its staff against the stone tiles. A wave of freezing blue ice expanded across the ground, encasing the table and the surrounding debris in thick layers of frost. Cayde activated his thruster boots, launching his titanium frame over the expanding ice. He landed on the roof of a fractured concrete pillar. He loaded incendiary rounds into his hand cannon cylinder and fired directly at the soldier. The explosive rounds shattered the dark blue stasis crystals mounted on the alien's armor. Crow sprinted along the edge of the road, firing his solar hand cannon into the exposed joints of the second alien. The light-bearer generated a sharp, woven blade of green strand energy, leaped into the air, and severed the alien's tall metal staff into two distinct pieces. Cayde reached to his belt and unclipped a bundle of solar explosives. He primed the detonator and threw the heavy bundle directly at the feet of the first soldier. The blast engulfed the alien in a column of intense thermal energy, melting the geometric armor plates into liquid slag. Sundance materialized beside Cayde's shoulder, her geometric shell spinning as she projected a blue scanning beam across the frozen terrain. She verified the total physical elimination of the hostile units and retreated back into his utility pouch. Cayde holstered his hand cannon and jumped down from the pillar. His metal boots cracked the thin layer of ice covering the pavement. He looked toward the horizon. The recreated asphalt road ended abruptly at the edge of a massive, jagged chasm. A towering black monolith rose from the center of the chasm, extending upward into the swirling pink energy filling the sky. The monolith consisted of smooth, dark glass and sharp, intersecting geometric angles. Yellow energy pulsed from the seams between the glass panels. The structure housed the physical command center of the witness. Cayde pointed his metal index finger at the monolith. He adjusted the heavy fabric of his brown cloak, pulled a fresh cylinder of ammunition from his utility pouch, and loaded his hand cannon. He stepped to the very edge of the chasm, charting a direct physical route down the steep rock face, and preparing to descend into the lowest levels of the dark structure. Cayde-6 led the descent into the chasm, utilizing his thruster boots to slow his physical fall alongside Crow and the Lightbearer. They landed on a wide platform constructed entirely of the dark, smooth glass that formed the monolith. The yellow energy pulsing between the glass panels illuminated the area, casting long shadows across the floor. They walked through a towering archway and entered the central chamber of the monolith. A massive, shifting entity floated in the center of the room. This entity consisted of a towering physical form draped in dark, flowing robes. Hundreds of smaller faces pushed against the fabric of the robes, forming an ever-changing surface of distinct, individual visages. The entity possessed a pale grey face with solid black eyes and projected a thick cloud of swirling dark energy above its head. This was the Witness. The Witness raised a long, pale hand and projected a wave of dark, concussive energy across the chamber. Cayde activated his thruster boots, launching his titanium frame sideways behind a dark glass pillar. The energy wave struck the pillar, cracking the glass and sending shards flying into the air. Crow threw a concentrated sphere of solar plasma directly at the entity. The Witness extended a finger, generating a thin wall of geometric darkness that instantly absorbed the solar charge. The Lightbearer engaged their strand abilities, forming a heavy, woven green shield and firing concentrated kinetic rounds at the entity's chest. The rounds struck the flowing robes, ricocheting harmlessly off the shifting faces. The Witness rotated its massive physical form, focusing its attention entirely on the Lightbearer. It generated a localized gravity well, pulling the Lightbearer off the floor and suspending them in the air. Thick bands of dark energy wrapped around the Lightbearer's limbs, compressing their armor and crushing their void shield. Cayde stepped out from behind the shattered pillar. He reloaded his hand cannon with specialized incendiary rounds and aimed directly at the massive cloud of dark energy swirling above the entity's head. He fired a rapid sequence of shots. The explosive rounds penetrated the cloud, detonating inside the concentrated darkness and breaking the entity's physical concentration. The gravity well collapsed, dropping the Lightbearer onto the glass floor. Crow materialized a burning solar sword in his hands and charged directly at the Witness. He swung the blade in a wide, horizontal arc, aiming for the entity's pale face. The Witness generated a dense stasis crystal, blocking the sword strike and freezing the solar energy upon impact. Cayde advanced across the chamber, moving in tight synchronization with the other two Lightbearers. He threw a bundle of explosive trip mines directly onto the stasis crystal, detonating the charges and shattering the ice. The combined physical assault forced the Witness backward toward the center of the room. The Witness raised both hands, pulling dark energy directly from the swirling cloud above its head. It focused the energy into a massive, concentrated beam and fired it directly at Cayde. The Exo raised his hand cannon, but the beam struck his chest plating before he could pull the trigger. The physical impact threw Cayde across the room, slamming his metal frame into the far wall. The dark energy burned through his titanium armor, searing the synthetic fluid lines and melting his internal power core. He collapsed onto the floor, his carbon joints seizing completely. Sundance materialized beside him, projecting her blue scanning beam over the massive burn wound. The dark energy radiating from the injury actively repelled the light, preventing the ghost from initiating her healing protocols. The Lightbearer and Crow intensified their assault, utilizing every available physical weapon and energy projection to keep the Witness pinned in the center of the chamber. Cayde dragged his metal frame across the glass floor, pulling himself toward the edge of the platform overlooking the deep chasm. He reached into his chest cavity and pulled out the charred paper journal. He opened the book to the pages displaying the ink drawings of the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts. The dark energy continued to burn through his internal systems, shutting down his optical sensors and muting his audio processors. He gripped his hand cannon tightly, pointing the barrel toward the massive entity dominating the room. He routed the remaining physical power from his failing core directly into the weapon's firing mechanism, overcharging the final explosive round loaded in the cylinder. He pushed his damaged chassis up onto one knee, resting the heavy barrel of the hand cannon on his metal forearm, and locked his fading optics onto the pale face of the witness. Cayde pulled the trigger. The heavy firing pin struck the primer of the explosive round. The physical recoil pushed his damaged titanium arm upward, forcing the barrel to kick. The high-caliber slug cleared the chamber and traveled across the dark glass chamber. It struck the pale face of the witness, directly between the solid black eyes. The explosive core detonated on impact. The concussive blast shattered the gray, calcified surface of the entity's face, exposing a chaotic mass of writhing, formless dark energy underneath. The witness staggered backward, the massive cloud of swirling darkness above its head flickering rapidly. The physical distraction allowed Crow to close the remaining distance. He lunged forward, driving the burning solar blade directly into the exposed mass of dark energy on the entity's face. The intense heat of the light seared the darkness, turning the swirling energy into bright, white-hot plasma. The light-bearer engaged the strand grapples, securing thick green cables to the glass pillars on either side of the room. They pulled the cables taut, launching themselves feet first into the entity's chest. The physical impact knocked the massive form completely off balance. The witness crashed onto the dark glass floor, the dark robes tearing against the sharp edges of the shattered pillars. The entity writhed on the floor, the hundreds of individual faces pushing against the fabric, contorting in silent screams. The dark energy leaking from the wounds began to rapidly calcify, turning the immediate surrounding area into solid, immovable stone. The witness raised a pale hand, attempting to project another gravity well, but the concentration of light from the solar blade and the strand cables actively suppressed the dark energy. Cayde pushed himself up onto his remaining functional leg. His optical sensors flickered, switching rapidly between bright blue and dead gray. The synthetic fluids leaking from his chest cavity pooled on the glass floor, smoking as they reacted with the ambient thermal energy of the room. He holstered the empty hand cannon and pulled a heavy metallic cylinder from his utility pouch. This cylinder contained a raw, unrefined core of concentrated light, salvaged from the remains of a destroyed Guardian jumpship. He activated his thruster boots for the final time. The thrusters sputtered, emitting a shower of orange sparks before propelling his heavy frame across the room. He landed directly on the chest of the fallen entity. He drove his metal fist downward, smashing the glass surface of the floor directly next to the witness's head. He jammed the metallic cylinder into the crack in the glass. He reached into his belt, retrieved the heavily modified ignition key from his jumpship, and shoved it into the top of the cylinder. He looked at Crow and the light-bearer, pointing his metal finger toward the heavy stone archway leading out of the chamber. He twisted the ignition key. The cylinder hummed with a loud rising frequency. The concentrated light inside the core expanded rapidly, overloading the internal containment field. The resulting explosion consumed the entire chamber in a blinding sphere of pure white light. The physical blast wave vaporized the dark glass floor, melted the shattered pillars, and completely annihilated the physical form of the witness. The shockwave threw Crow and the light-bearer backward through the archway, tumbling them across the wide stone platform outside. They hit the ground and slid across the pale roots, their armor smoking from the intense heat of the blast. The entire physical structure of the dark monolith collapsed inward, the massive geometric angles folding in on themselves and dissolving into the swirling pink energy of the sky. The light-bearer pushed themselves off the ground, leaning heavily on the pulse rifle. They walked to the edge of the platform and looked down into the deep chasm. The monolith was entirely gone. A wide, smooth crater of scorched white stone remained in its place. The thick cloud of pink energy filling the sky rapidly dissipated, revealing the clear, open expanse of the traveler's interior void. The ambient hum of the environment faded into total silence. Crow walked to the edge of the crater and knelt on the warm stone. He found a single, scorched piece of titanium plating resting in the dust. The metal bore the distinct, faded white paint and deep scratch marks of Cayde's chest chassis. Crow picked up the metal plate, running his pale fingers over the blackened edges. He turned it over. A small, physical piece of charred paper remained fused to the underside of the titanium, preserved by the intense heat of the blast. The graphite lines forming the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts remained visible on the paper. Crow placed the metal plate into the utility pouch on his belt. The light-bearer slung the pulse rifle over their shoulder, turned away from the crater, and walked back up the pathway of woven light, heading toward the transport skiff. The light-bearer pulled the metal shell of their ghost from their utility pouch and held it flat in the palms of their hands. The geometric pieces of the shell sat misaligned, featuring wide cracks along the outer casing. The central mechanical eye consisted of dull, gray glass. The internal servos rested completely motionless. Crow walked up to the light-bearer and looked down at the broken machine. He lowered his solar sword, the burning blade condensing into a small puff of white smoke. Cayde-6 stepped across the scorched white stone of the crater. The metal joints in his knees clicked, and the heavy fabric of the torn brown cloak dragged against the ground. Cayde stopped in front of the light-bearer. He looked at the shattered ghost resting in their hands. He shifted his gaze to Crow, and he looked up at the clearing sky inside the traveler. The dense thickets of pale roots surrounding the platform pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm of white energy. Cayde reached out with his right arm and placed his titanium hand directly over the broken shell of the ghost. He opened the repaired titanium plating on his chest. He gripped the core of concentrated light burning inside his chassis. He forced the physical energy out of his chest cavity and channeled it straight down his metal arm. Thick strands of bright, burning solar light flowed from his fingertips and poured directly into the cracks of the ghost's shell. The intense heat washed over the light-bearer's gloves. The metallic fragments of the ghost snapped together, fusing the cracks into smooth, seamless polymer and steel. The central mechanical eye ignited, glowing with a bright, piercing blue light. The internal servos whined, and the ghost floated upward from the light-bearer's hands, spinning its geometric shell in the air. Cayde retracted his arm and took a slow step backward. The flow of energy out of his chest cavity continued. The physical structure of his titanium plating began to separate into individual strands of glowing code. The edges of his metal shoulders and the carbon joints in his arms dissolved into tiny, bright white particles. The particles drifted upward, caught in the atmospheric drafts of the traveler's interior. Cayde kept his optical sensors locked onto the light-bearer and the active ghost. He engaged his vocal processors, emitting a final string of synthesized audio consisting of a short, sharp laugh and a direct verbal statement regarding his intent to find the physical entities he had sketched in his paper journal. The dissolution accelerated, spreading down his mechanical legs and across his chest plate. The glowing blue light in his optical sensors dimmed to a pale white, matching the color of the energy consuming his frame. The heavy brown cloak slipped from his dissolving shoulders and pooled on the white stone platform. His metal frame collapsed entirely, breaking apart into a dense cloud of bright energy. The cloud expanded and rose higher into the sky, merging completely with the ambient light, radiating from the pale tree roots. The physical paper journal fell from the center of the dissolving mass and landed flat on the stone tiles. Crow walked forward and knelt beside the book. He picked it up, feeling the charred leather binding and the frayed paper edges. He opened the cover and looked at the graphite sketches of the Ace of Spades and the Queen of Hearts. He closed the book and placed it securely into a sealed compartment on his belt. He picked up the heavy brown cloak from the ground, folded the fabric over his forearm, and turned back toward the floating stone pathway. The light-bearer walked beside him, following the glowing blue light of their restored ghost as they navigated the path leading back to the transport skiff. The flames in the stone hearth crackle, popping loudly as a thick log splits down the center and drops a shower of orange embers onto the ash. The fire casts shifting light across the concrete walls of the tower, illuminating the heavy metal crates and stacked canvas packs resting in the corner. You sit in the padded armchair, your boots planted firmly on the woven rug, and the ambient heat from the fire radiates across your armored chest plate. The storytelling reaches its physical conclusion. The sound of the burning wood and the low hum of the wind blowing outside the glass windows fill the room. The heavy kinetic rounds, sharp alien blades, and corrosive chemical spills leave physical indentations on titanium chassis and biological tissue alike during deployments across the planetary frontiers. A light-bearer carries these physical indentations on their armor, holding physical paper journals and metal coins in their pouches to maintain a tangible record of specific locations and individuals. Cayde-6 left his physical markings across the solar system, scattering weapon caches on distant planetoids and dropping a strip of dark fur into an incinerator chute. He expended his final unit of concentrated energy to repair a shattered geometric shell, restoring the functional capabilities of another light-bearer's ghost before his own components dissolved into the atmosphere. The physical evidence of his presence remains secured inside the pouches and footlockers of the individuals who walked beside him. The fire burns down to a pile of glowing red coals. The ambient temperature in the room drops slightly, signaling the late hour of the planetary rotation. The physical rest cycle provides the necessary time for biological muscles to repair microtears and for synthetic processors to clear temporary data caches. Keep your physical gear stationed near the door and allow your optical sensors to close and block the light. I will remain seated near the hearth, adding small pieces of kindling to the coals to maintain the heat. I look forward to sharing another physical log of events with you upon your return to this specific room.